I'm standing in a crystal ballroom surrounded by 300 wedding guests in designer gowns and tailored suits. Champagne is flowing. The orchestra is playing. My younger sister, the golden child, is glowing in her $10,000 wedding dress at the head table. And then she looks directly at my 8-year-old adopted daughter and says loud enough for everyone to hear, "Well, you know what they say, adopted girls eat leftovers." The room erupts in laughter. My mother doubles over, wiping tears from her eyes. My father slaps the table, grinning. Guests are recording it on their phones, thinking it's all part of some hilarious family joke. But my daughter's face. I watch her crumble. I watch tears pool in her eyes as she tries to make herself smaller and visible, just like I've done my entire life in this family. For 42 years, I've been the scapegoat, the responsible one, the one who's supposed to smile and take it. But tonight something inside me doesn't just break. It ignites. I pull out my phone, I dial a number, and I say 3 words that will destroy this perfect wedding in less than 20 minutes. Pack for donation. What they don't know, what they can't know, is that I'm the one who signed the venue contract. And buried in that contract is a clause that gives me the power to end this wedding with a single phone call. They're about to learn that silence has a price, that leftovers can feast, and that the daughter they've dismissed for 4 decades just became the most powerful person in the room. Stay with me, because what happens next will shock you. And the way this story ends, you won't see it coming. My name is Sarah Chen. I'm 42 years old, and for the last 15 years, I've worked as a financial analyst for a mid-sized accounting firm in Seattle. I'm also a single mother to the most beautiful 8-year-old girl in the world, my daughter Emma, whom I adopted when she was just 3 months old. People always told me that choosing to become a mother on my own was brave, but I never saw it that way. I just knew I had love to give, and Emma needed someone to give it to. What I didn't know back then was that my decision would create a fault line in my family that would never quite heal. Until tonight, I'd spent years trying to pretend that fault line didn't exist. The Grand Bellevue Ballroom was everything my sister Melissa had dreamed of for her wedding day. I stood near the edge of the reception hall, watching the scene unfold like something out of a luxury magazine spread. 3 massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, each one dripping with what must have been thousands of individual prisms that caught the light and scattered it across the room in dancing rainbows. A 12-piece string orchestra played softly from an elevated stage draped in white silk, their music weaving through the conversations of 300 guests dressed in their finest evening wear. Champagne towers stood at each corner of the room, the golden liquid cascading down tier after tier of delicate crystal flutes. The tables were draped in ivory linens so pristine they seemed to glow, each centerpiece a towering arrangement of white roses, peonies, and orchids that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. At the head table, Melissa looked like a princess in her custom-designed gown, all silk and lace and tiny pearl buttons running down her back. Her blonde hair was swept up in an elaborate updo that had taken her stylist 3 hours to create, with delicate flowers woven throughout. She was radiant, glowing with the kind of joy that comes from knowing you're the absolute center of attention and everything is perfect. My parents sat on either side of her, my father in his tailored tuxedo and my mother in a champagne-colored gown that she'd flown to New York to buy specifically for this occasion. They beamed with pride, soaking in the admiration of relatives and friends who kept approaching to congratulate them on throwing such a spectacular event. I sat at a table near the back with Emma beside me. My daughter looked precious in the pink dress we'd picked out together, not nearly as expensive as what the other children were wearing, but she'd loved it in the store, spinning in front of the mirror with such pure delight that I would have bought it regardless of the price. She'd been so excited about tonight, about being part of a real fancy party, as she'd called it. She'd practiced her manners all week, determined to make me proud. The trouble started during the toasts. Melissa's maid of honor had just finished a sweet speech about friendship and forever love, and everyone was still laughing at her closing joke when Melissa herself stood up, champagne flute in hand. The room fell into an expectant hush. My sister had always been good at commanding attention. It was a gift she'd been born with. Or maybe one my parents had cultivated so carefully that it seemed natural. "I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight." Melissa began, her voice clear and bright. "This is honestly the happiest day of my life, and sharing it with all of you makes it even more special." She gestured around the room, her smile wide and genuine. People applauded politely, waiting for more. "I'm so grateful for my family, my amazing parents, who gave me everything I could ever want, who taught me what real love looks like." Mom dabbed at her eyes with her napkin. Dad raised his glass. Then Melissa's gaze drifted to our table in the back. Her smile shifted, not dramatically, but I'd known my sister for 42 years. I saw the change. It went from warm to something else, something with an edge. And of course, my big sister Sarah and her daughter. She paused, and in that pause I felt something cold settle in my chest. You know, Sarah's always been the responsible one in the family. Always doing everything by the book, always making the practical choices. Her tone was light, almost teasing, but there was something underneath it that made my shoulders tense. Emma squeezed my hand under the table, sensing the shift, even if she didn't understand it. Melissa took a sip of champagne, and when she lowered the glass, her expression had changed again. The smile was still there, but now it looked sharp. "Actually, speaking of family traditions," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom, "there's something funny I've been meaning to share." She looked directly at Emma, and my stomach dropped. "You know what they say, right? Adopted girls eat leftovers." For a moment, the room seemed suspended in disbelief. Then someone laughed a nervous, uncertain sound. And then someone else joined in. And then my mother's unmistakable laugh rang out loud and genuine, and suddenly the entire ballroom was erupting in laughter. People were wiping their eyes, nudging each other, some even raising their glasses, as if my sister had delivered the toast of the century. My father was red-faced from laughing so hard, slapping the table in front of him. Melissa stood at the head table, looking pleased with herself, soaking in the reaction like applause. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was look down at Emma's face. My daughter's smile had frozen in place, her eyes wide and confused. She looked up at me, trying to understand if this was a joke she was supposed to laugh at too. And then I watched, helpless, paralyzed, as understanding crept into her expression. Her lower lip began to tremble. Her eyes filled with tears that she tried desperately to blink back. Her small hand went slack in mine. She pulled away from me slightly, making herself smaller in her chair, as if by shrinking she could become invisible. Something inside me shifted. Not broke, that's not the right word. It was more like a lock clicking open, releasing something that had been caged for a very long time. I looked up from Emma's devastated face and scanned the room through the blur of my own tears. Most people were still chuckling, returning to their conversations, already moving on from what they clearly thought was just harmless family ribbing. But in the very back corner, I noticed an older woman, maybe 70, wearing an elegant navy dress with her phone raised. She wasn't laughing. She was filming. Our eyes met across the crowded ballroom, and she gave me the smallest nod, then tucked her phone away. My own phone was already in my hand, though I didn't remember picking it up. The screen was lit, my recent calls displayed. At the top of the list, Daniel Park Venue Manager. My thumb moved over his name, as if guided by something outside myself. Behind me, barely audible over the returning buzz of conversation and music, Emma's voice was so small it could have been carried away by a breath. "Mommy, can we go home now?" My thumb came down on the call button. As the phone rang in my ear, time seemed to stretch and fold in on itself. In that moment, with Emma's quiet devastation beside me and the ballroom's laughter still echoing my mind, flooded with memories of how we'd arrived at this point. 8 years dissolved in an instant, and I was back in that small office at the adoption agency, sitting in an uncomfortable chair with my hands folded so tightly in my lap that my knuckles had turned white. I'd been 34 years old then, and I'd spent the previous 6 months filling out what felt like endless reams of paperwork. Background checks, financial statements, personal essays about why I wanted to become a mother, letters of recommendation from friends and employers, medical records, psychological evaluations. Every aspect of my life had been examined and documented and filed away in folders that kept growing thicker. My caseworker, a kind woman named Patricia, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, had guided me through each step with patient encouragement. But even she had looked concerned when I told her I was doing this alone without a partner, without even the promise of one on the horizon. My family had been less kind about it. When I'd announced my decision to pursue adoption as a single mother, my father had actually laughed, certain I was joking. When he realized I was serious, his face had turned stony. "This is selfish, Sarah," he'd said, his voice cold with disappointment. "A child needs two parents, a proper family. What you're doing is just proving that you cannot thinking about what's actually best for a kid." My mother had been quieter in her disapproval, but no less clear. "If you just tried harder to find someone," she'd said, as if finding a life partner was simply a matter of effort like training for a marathon. "Melissa has a boyfriend now, you know. She's doing things the right way." Even then, even before Emma existed in my world, my sister was held up as the model I should aspire to follow. But I'd moved forward anyway because I'd known with absolute certainty that I had love to give. I'd known that my small two-bedroom apartment with its creaky floors and outdated kitchen was capable of becoming a home. I'd known that the life I'd built, stable job, solid savings, a circle of good friends, was enough to provide security and happiness to a child who needed both. The day Patricia called to tell me they'd found a match, I'd been at work reviewing a client's quarterly taxes. I'd stepped into an empty conference room to take the call, and when she'd told me about a 3-month-old baby girl who'd been placed in foster care and was now cleared for adoption, I'd cried so hard that my boss had come looking for me, worried something terrible had happened. In a way, something had happened. My entire life had shifted on its axis, realigning around this tiny person I hadn't even met yet. 3 weeks later, I'd walked into the foster family's home for our first meeting. The foster mother had placed Emma in my arms, and I'd looked down at this impossibly small baby with her shock of dark hair and her serious, watchful eyes, and I'd felt my heart crack open in a way I hadn't known was possible. She'd been so light, so fragile, wrapped in a yellow blanket that was probably the softest thing I'd ever touched. When her tiny fingers had curled around my thumb, gripping with surprising strength, I'd made her a silent promise. "Right then, I will protect you. I will make sure you always know you're loved. No one will ever make you feel less than whole." The months that followed had been the most exhausting and most joyful of my life. Those first sleepless nights when Emma would wake crying every 2 hours, and I'd stumble through the dark apartment to warm bottles and change diapers and rock her back to sleep in the second-hand glider I'd bought from a neighbor. The morning I'd woken to find her watching me from her crib, not crying but just observing with those thoughtful eyes. And when I'd smiled at her, she'd smiled back for the very first time. The afternoon she'd taken her first wobbly steps across our living room, lurching from the coffee table to my outstretched arms with such determination on her face that I'd cheered loud enough to startle her into sitting down hard on her padded bottom. Emma had grown into the most curious, gentle child I'd ever known. Everything fascinated her. Why did birds fly but butterflies flutter? Why was the sky blue during the day but dark at night? Why did some people have families and others didn't? I'd tried to answer every question honestly at a level she could understand, because I'd wanted her to know that curiosity was a gift, that asking questions was how we learned about the world. I'd also tried to teach her the values my own grandmother had taught me back when I was small. My Nai had been a force of nature, a Chinese immigrant who'd worked in restaurant kitchens her whole life and had strong opinions about fairness and dignity. "Everyone deserves a seat at the table," she'd say in her accented English, pointing her cooking spoon for emphasis. "No one eats last. You understand? In my house, everyone eats first. Everyone equal." I'd carried those words with me through childhood, through college, through all the years my own parents had shown me what it looked like when people didn't live by those values. And I'd pass them on to Emma, hoping they'd be her armor against a world that didn't always treat people fairly. But even armor had its weak points. Emma had been 5 years old, sitting at our kitchen table working on a coloring book, when she'd looked up at me and asked with heartbreaking casualness, "How come Grandma and Aunt Melissa don't come visit us? My friend Zoe's grandma comes every Sunday." I'd frozen with a dish towel in my hands, completely unprepared, despite knowing this question would come eventually. "They're just very busy, sweetheart," I'd said, hating myself for the lie even as it left my mouth. "They live far away and have a lot going on." The truth was that my parents had met Emma exactly 3 times in 5 years. 3 awkward, brief encounters where they'd maintained polite distance, as if afraid that getting too close might obligate them to something they weren't willing to give. They sent birthday cards with generic messages and their signatures, nothing more. They never asked about her milestones, her interests, her dreams. Melissa had been even worse, treating Emma's existence like an embarrassing secret, never mentioning her to friends, never including us in family photos she posted on social media. Emma had accepted my explanation that day because she'd trusted me completely. Children do that. They believe what we tell them because we're their whole world, their source of truth and safety. And I'd abused that trust by lying to her, by protecting people who didn't deserve protection, by choosing a comfortable fiction over a painful reality. Sitting in that ballroom phone pressed to my ear as it continued to ring, I realized something with perfect clarity. I'd promised her on that first day I held her, no one would ever make her feel less than whole. Tonight I'd broken that promise by bringing her into a space where cruelty was disguised as humor, where her worth was denied in front of hundreds of witnesses. But I was about to keep a different one. The phone continued to ring as decades of memories cascaded through my mind, each one a small cut that had never quite healed. This pattern of favoritism hadn't started tonight, hadn't started when I adopted Emma, hadn't even started in adulthood. It had been woven into the fabric of our family since Melissa was born when I was 7 years old, and suddenly demoted from cherished only child to the responsible older sister whose needs would always come second. I remembered my 10th birthday with painful clarity. I'd asked for a bicycle, a blue one I'd seen at the department store with a white basket on the front. Instead, I'd received a desk lamp and a dictionary because, as my father explained while Melissa blew out candles on half of my birthday cake, "You're getting to the age where you need to focus on your studies." 3 months later, for Melissa's 3rd birthday, our parents threw a party with a rented bounce house and a magician, and she'd received so many toys that they'd had to buy additional storage bins. When I'd asked why her birthday was different from mine, my mother had cupped my face and said, "You're my big girl. You understand that little ones need more attention, don't you?" I'd nodded because that's what big girls did. They understood. They didn't complain. By the time I was 16, I'd learned to expect nothing. Christmas mornings were exercises in manufactured gratitude as I unwrapped practical items, clothes from discount stores, school supplies I actually needed, while Melissa tore through piles of wrapped boxes containing jewelry designer handbags, gift certificates to expensive stores. When I'd started looking at colleges, my parents had made it clear that they expected me to commute to the state university to save money. "We need to be smart about finances," Dad had said. "You're sensible enough to understand that." But when Melissa had barely graduated high school 5 years later, they'd somehow found the money to send her to a private liberal arts college 3 states away, complete with a new laptop, a generous monthly allowance, and a spring break trip to Cancun, because she'd worked so hard. She'd lasted a year and a half before dropping out, citing stress and a need to find herself. The tuition they'd already paid, nearly $40,000, was simply absorbed as a loss. No lectures about responsibility. No disappointed sighs, no demands that she pay them back. Just understanding nods and reassurances that she'd figure out her path eventually. When I'd asked to borrow $500 during graduate school because my car had died and I needed it to get to my internship, my father had actually laughed. "Sarah, you're 26 years old and you've always been so good with money. I'm sure you'll figure something out." I'd taken out a credit card with a predatory interest rate and spent 2 years paying it off. The car situation with Melissa had been perhaps the most infuriating example of their double standard. They'd bought her first car when she turned 16, a cute little sedan she'd named Daisy. She'd totaled it within 6 months texting while driving, rear-ending someone at a red light. "Accidents happen," Mom had soothed. "She feels terrible about it." They'd bought her a second car. She'd wrecked that one too less than a year later, sideswiping a parked car while trying to parallel park and then leaving the scene. That time, there'd been a police report and insurance complications, and I'd expected consequences. Instead, Dad had called her spirited and still learning while he wrote another check. The third car came with slightly more lectures but just as much financial support. Meanwhile, when I'd been in a minor fender bender at 19 entirely, the other driver's fault with police reports to prove it, my parents had suggested I should have been more defensive in my driving, and maybe I wasn't ready for the responsibility of a vehicle. I'd thought perhaps things would change as we became adults, that the favoritism would fade as we established our own lives. Instead, it had simply evolved into new forms. I was expected to host every Thanksgiving and Christmas at my apartment, despite having the smallest living space, while Melissa was excused because planning parties stressed her out. I was expected to remember everyone's birthdays to send cards and thoughtful gifts, while Melissa's forgotten obligations were laughed off with, "Oh, you know how scattered she is." When she'd needed someone to watch her friend's cat for 2 weeks, she'd called me at work and simply assumed I'd do it, never asking if it was convenient, never offering to pay for the cat food or litter I'd had to buy. The criticism of my parenting had started the moment I'd brought Emma home. Melissa had taken one look at my precious daughter and said, "I hope you know what you're getting into. Adopted kids have issues, attachment problems. You might regret this." My mother had nodded in agreement, adding, "It's just so much harder than having your own. You'll see." And they'd said this within Emma's earshot, as if a baby couldn't sense tension and disapproval, as if their words weren't already laying the groundwork for a lifetime of feeling unwelcome. Yet somehow, despite their stated concerns about my questionable parenting choices, Melissa had no problem calling me last summer when she'd needed someone to watch her friend's niece for an entire weekend. "You're so good at the mom thing," she'd said breezily. "And Emma needs to learn to share attention anyway." I'd done it because I'd been conditioned since age 7 to say yes to be helpful, to not make waves. The friend had never even thanked me. Every family gathering followed the same script. My accomplishments were met with polite nods, Melissa's with effusive praise. When I'd been promoted to senior analyst, a position I'd worked toward for 5 years, my father had said, "That's nice, honey," and immediately turned to ask Melissa about her latest boyfriend. When Melissa had landed a part-time job at a boutique they'd celebrated with champagne and talked about it for months as if she'd been appointed to the Supreme Court. If I ever dared to point out the inequality, my mother's response was always the same: "Why do you have to keep score? Can't you just be happy for your sister? You've always been so competitive." I wasn't competitive. I was exhausted. Exhausted from carrying the invisible weight of being the dependable one, the one who could handle disappointment, the one whose feelings were always considered less important because I was strong enough to manage them on my own. Every time I'd set a boundary or expressed hurt, I'd been labeled difficult, ungrateful, too sensitive. Every time Melissa had thrown a tantrum or made demands, she'd been accommodated because that's just how she is, and she doesn't mean anything by it. Sitting in that ballroom hearing my daughter's small voice asking to go home, I understood something with crystalline clarity. For 42 years, I'd been the family's doormat. I'd absorbed their casual cruelty, their thoughtless dismissals, their endless expectations without reciprocation. I'd told myself it was easier to go along than to fight, that being the bigger person was somehow noble. But that night at the wedding, watching my daughter's tears, seeing her try to make herself invisible because my family had taught her that her presence was shameful, something inside me didn't just break. It ignited. The flame that ignited in me that night had actually been lit 8 months earlier, though I hadn't recognized it at the time. It had been a Saturday morning in early spring when Melissa had called, her voice bright with excitement and just the slightest undertone of desperation that I'd learned to recognize over the years. She'd gotten engaged to someone named Marcus, a man she'd been dating for only 4 months, and whom none of us had actually met. The wedding was scheduled for October, she'd gushed, and she'd already found the perfect venue, the Grand Bellevue Ballroom, the place where every society wedding in Seattle took place. There was just one tiny little problem. "My credit is temporarily bad," she'd explained, the words tumbling out quickly, as if speed might make them less significant. "You know how it is, some mix-up with old bills, nothing serious, but the venue requires the person signing the contract to have a credit score above 700. Yours is perfect, right? You're always so responsible with money." The flattery had been transparent, but I'd listened anyway. "It's literally just a formality. They just need your name on the paperwork so we can get this amazing discount they're offering. 10% off if we book before the end of the month. Please, Sarah, I'm begging you. This is my dream wedding." I'd felt the familiar tug of obligation, the ingrained response to help, when asked to be the reliable sister who solved problems. But something had made me hesitate. Maybe it was the fact that she'd described her credit situation as temporarily bad, when I knew from previous conversations that she had multiple accounts in collections. Maybe it was the way she'd framed it as doing her a favor when really she was asking me to take on legal liability for an event that would cost tens of thousands of dollars. Maybe I'd simply reached some invisible threshold of being taken advantage of. "Let me think about it," I'd said, and before she could protest, I'd added, "I need to review the contract first. Send it to me, and I'll look it over this weekend." The contract had arrived in my email within an hour, a 12-page document dense with legal terminology and standard venue policies. I'd printed it out and spent that evening reading every word, highlighter in hand, making notes in the margins. What I'd found hadn't surprised me. The primary signatory, which would be me, bore full financial responsibility for the event. If anything went wrong, if payments weren't made, if there was damage to the property, it would be my credit score taking the hit, my bank account being pursued by collections, potentially my assets being targeted in a lawsuit. On Monday morning, I'd called my friend Jennifer, who'd gone to law school and now worked in contract law for a tech company. Over coffee in her firm's lobby, I'd explained the situation. She'd skimmed the contract with a practiced eye, occasionally humming thoughtfully or circling sections with her pen. "You could just say no," she'd pointed out. "This is a lot of liability to take on for someone with documented financial irresponsibility." I'd nodded, knowing she was right, but also knowing that saying no would result in weeks of family pressure, guilt trips, and accusations that I was sabotaging Melissa's happiness. "What if I added a clause?" I'd asked. "Something that would give me an out if things went badly." Jennifer had leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Now you're thinking like a lawyer. What kind of clause did you have in mind?" Together, we'd crafted language that was specific enough to be enforceable, but vague enough to pass casual inspection. Section 7.3, buried on page 9 between clauses about liability insurance and damage deposits, now read, "Primary signatory reserves the right to terminate event immediately upon documented harassment or humiliation of primary signatory or their legal dependents by secondary parties or their guests. Upon such termination, all deposits become non-refundable and may be donated to charitable organizations at primary signatory's discretion. Secondary parties remain liable for any outstanding balance as per original payment schedule." Jennifer had made sure the language was airtight. Documented meant there needed to be proof, which could include witness statements, video footage, or written records. Legal dependents explicitly included Emma. Secondary parties clearly identified Melissa and our parents, who'd insisted on being listed as co-hosts to ensure they could make decisions about the event. The clause gave me complete authority to pull the plug if they crossed a line, and it ensured they'd suffer financial consequences for doing so. I'd emailed the modified contract to Melissa with a note, "Had my lawyer friend review this, made a few small adjustments for our protection. Let me know if the venue approves the changes." And the venue's event coordinator had called me directly, a woman named Patricia with a warm professional voice. "Ms. Chen, we've reviewed your proposed amendments. Section 7.3 is actually quite reasonable from our perspective. It protects you and limits our liability if there are interpersonal conflicts during the event. We're happy to incorporate this language." The signing had taken place at our parents' house 3 weeks later. Mom had made her famous lemon cake for the occasion, treating the contract signing like a celebration. Melissa had been vibrating with excitement, already talking about dress fittings and flower arrangements. Dad had barely glanced at the documents, too busy discussing golf with Marcus, who'd finally made an appearance and seemed pleasant enough, if somewhat distant. When I'd placed the contract on the dining room table and handed out pens, Melissa had actually laughed. 12 pages, seriously. Sarah, you're so paranoid. It's just a party venue, not a mortgage. She'd flipped to the signature page without reading a single word, scrawling her name with a flourish. Mom and Dad had done the same, chuckling about all this lawyer talk and Sarah always making things complicated. I'd pointed to where each of them needed to sign and initial watching as they completed every required field without once asking what they were agreeing to. You're all set, I'd said, placing my own signature on the primary signatory line and dating it carefully. I'd made copies for everyone and filed my original in my home office in a folder labeled Melissa's Wedding that also contained Jennifer's notes and the original unmodified contract for comparison. 2 weeks before the wedding, Daniel Park, the venue manager, had called me on my cell during my lunch break. Ms. Chen, this is just a courtesy call to confirm all the details for the Morrison event. I wanted to make sure you understood that as primary signatory, you have full authority over this event per the contract terms, including Section 7.3. Whatever you decide goes. We'll follow your instructions. I'd stood in the parking lot outside my office building, phone pressed to my ear, feeling the weight of what he was really saying. He was telling me that if I needed to use that clause, he'd back me up. I understand, I'd said slowly. Let's hope we never need that clause. He'd agreed quietly, professionally, and we'd ended the call. I'd gone back to my desk and returned to my spreadsheets, pushing the conversation to the back of my mind, telling myself it was just a precaution that would never be necessary. 1 month before the wedding, I'd scheduled a walkthrough of the venue with Daniel Park to review the final arrangements. Melissa had been too busy with dress alterations to attend, and our parents had simply assumed I'd handle the logistics since I was, after all, the responsible one. I'd brought Emma with me because it was a Saturday, and my usual babysitter had been unavailable. She'd been excited about seeing the fancy party place, skipping beside me as we'd walked up the curved driveway to the Grand Bellevue's ornate entrance. Daniel had been waiting for us in the lobby, a man in his late 30s with kind eyes and an easy smile. He'd worn a perfectly tailored navy suit and had greeted me with a firm handshake before crouching down to Emma's level. "And who is this young lady?" he'd asked warmly. Emma had hidden slightly behind my leg, suddenly shy, but had whispered her name. Daniel's expression had softened in a way that seemed genuinely tender, not the practiced politeness of someone who dealt with clients' children as part of his job. "She looks like a kind soul," he'd said, standing back up and meeting my eyes. "Just like someone I used to know." There had been something in his tone that had caught my attention, a weight to those simple words that suggested a story beneath them. But before I could respond, he'd gestured toward the ballroom. "Shall we review the setup? I want to make sure everything meets your expectations." We'd walked through the space, and he'd shown me where tables would be positioned, where the orchestra would set up, how the lighting could be adjusted for different moods throughout the evening. Emma had been fascinated by everything, her eyes wide as she'd taken in the crystal chandeliers and the polished marble floors that reflected light like still water. After the ballroom tour, Daniel had invited us back to his office to review the timeline and final payment schedule. His office had been modest but elegant, with dark wood furniture and soft lighting that made it feel more like a study than a workspace. While he'd pulled up files on his computer, I'd glanced around at the framed certificates on his walls, the small bookshelf filled with event planning manuals and hospitality industry guides. And then my eyes had landed on a photograph in a simple black frame, slightly faded with age, tucked between two larger frames. I'd stood up without thinking, drawn to the image. It showed a church basement or community hall, long tables set up cafeteria-style, people of all ages sitting together eating from paper plates. And there, in the center of the photo, wearing an apron and holding a serving spoon, her silver hair pulled back in her signature bun, was my grandmother. My nai-nai caught mid-laugh, her face creased with joy as she dished food onto someone's plate. "That's my grandmother," I'd whispered, my voice catching. My hand had moved toward the frame, but I'd stopped myself from touching it. "Grace Chen, that's her." Daniel had gone very still behind his desk. When I'd turned to look at him, his eyes had been bright with emotion. "Mrs. Chen," he'd said softly, and the way he'd pronounced her name with such reverence had made my throat tighten. "She saved my life." He'd stood and come to stand beside me, both of us looking at the photograph. "I was 19 years old and living in my car," he'd begun, his voice quiet but steady. "I'd aged out of foster care at 18 with no family, no real job skills, just a high school diploma and a lot of anger at the world. I was parking behind that church trying to stay warm when your grandmother found me one morning. She didn't ask questions, didn't lecture me. She just said, 'You look hungry. Come inside.'" Daniel had smiled at the memory, though I could see the ghost of that desperate young man in his expression. "She fed me every single day for 8 months. Breakfast before I went to my construction job, dinner after I finished. She never made me feel like charity. She just set a place at the table like I was family. And she really talked to me about what I wanted from life. When I told her I'd always been good at organizing things, at planning, she'd nodded like I'd said something profound. She helped me apply to community college, helped me write my admissions essay, even came with me to talk to the financial aid office." I'd felt tears sliding down my cheeks as he'd spoken. Emma had come to stand beside me, sensing the importance of the moment, even if she couldn't fully understand it. "She came to my graduation," Daniel had continued. 2 years later, when I got my associate degree. She was in the audience, and when I walked across that stage, she'd stood up and cheered louder than anyone. She gave me a card that day with a $100 bill inside and a note that said, "For your next chapter, make it a good one." He'd paused, clearing his throat. "That money bought my first interview suit. I got hired as an assistant event coordinator at a hotel. Worked my way up. And when this position opened 5 years ago, managing the Grand Bellevue, I thought about Mrs. Chen and everything she'd taught me about treating people with dignity." We'd stood in silence for a moment, connected by the memory of a woman who'd been gone for 15 years, but whose impact continued to ripple outward. Finally, Daniel had turned to face me fully. "When I saw your name on the contract, Sarah Chen, I wondered if you might be related. And when I read Section 7.3, the clause about harassment and humiliation, I understood exactly why you'd added it." He'd glanced down at Emma, then back to me. "If anyone disrespects you or that little girl during this event, you just say the words. I'll make sure it's handled with dignity the way your grandmother would have wanted." The weight of what he was offering had settled over me. This wasn't just professional courtesy. This was a debt of honor being repaid, a promise being made to the memory of someone who'd shown kindness when it had mattered most. "The code phrase," I'd said slowly, thinking it through, "will be pack for donation. Can you do that?" Daniel had nodded solemnly, his expression completely serious. "For Mrs. Chen's granddaughter, it would be my honor." He'd pulled out his phone and made a note, then showed me his screen where he'd typed the phrase and my contact information. "If you call or text those words, we move immediately. No questions, no delays." As Emma and I had left that day, walking back through the elegant lobby toward the afternoon sunlight, Daniel had called after us from the doorway of his office. "Ms. Chen," I'd turned back. "I hope you never have to use it. I truly do. But if you do, I want you to know something." He'd paused, and his expression had been fierce with determination. "I've got 20 staff members who remember your grandmother. Some of them she fed, some of them she helped in other ways. We'll move fast." I'd arrived at the wedding that evening with cautious optimism, hoping that perhaps in the excitement and joy of her special day, Melissa might be kinder, that my parents might remember that Emma was their granddaughter too. That hope had begun to erode within the first hour. During the pre-ceremony photos, the photographer had gathered the bridal party on the venue's grand staircase for formal portraits. Emma had stood beside me in her pink dress, carefully holding the small clutch purse we'd picked out to match her outfit, watching the beautiful bridesmaids in their flowing gowns arrange themselves on the steps. One of Melissa's friends, a woman with sharp cheekbones and an even sharper voice, had glanced over at us and called out to the photographer, "Are we doing family photos now? Or just the bridal party?" The photographer had checked his list, looking confused. "I have down that we're doing bridal party first, then immediate family." The sharp-featured woman had looked directly at Emma, and then at me. "So whose kid is that?" she'd asked loud enough that the entire group had turned to look. There had been a beat of awkward silence before Melissa had waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, that's just my sister and her daughter. They're not in the photos." The "just" had hung in the air like smoke. Emma's hand had tightened in mine, her small fingers gripping hard enough that I'd felt her nails through my skin. We'd stepped back from the staircase, retreating to the edges of the scene while the photographer had continued arranging the bridal party, and I'd watched my daughter's face carefully compose itself into blankness, a skill no 8-year-old should have to master. Later, during the cocktail hour, I'd been speaking with a distant cousin I hadn't seen in years, when I'd overheard my mother's voice from a nearby cluster of guests. She'd been talking to an elderly woman in an elaborate hat, someone from her garden club, perhaps. "Such a beautiful wedding," the woman had said. "And is that your granddaughter over there? The little one in pink?" I'd frozen, waiting to hear how my mother would respond. There had been a pause just long enough to be noticeable before Mom had replied in a lowered voice that still carried, "She's adopted. From somewhere in Asia, we think. Sarah never told us much about it. We don't really talk about it." The way she'd said it, as if Emma were a shameful secret, as if my daughter's existence were something embarrassing that polite people shouldn't discuss, had made my stomach clench. Emma had been standing a few feet away, close enough to hear. I'd seen her shoulders draw up toward her ears, her body language shifting into that protective curl I'd come to recognize. She'd walked back to me and pressed against my side, and when I'd put my arm around her, I'd felt her trembling. "I'm okay, Mommy," she'd whispered preemptively, as if she needed to reassure me that she could handle being treated as less than human by her own family. The cruelty had continued in small cutting ways throughout the evening. When the children at the wedding had been called over for a group activity, a little boy around Emma's age had approached her tentatively. "Do you want to play?" he'd asked, holding up a small toy car. Emma had looked up at me, her eyes uncertain, and then had glanced toward where my parents sat at the head table watching us. "I don't think I'm allowed," she'd whispered to the boy, her voice so quiet I'd barely heard it. The boy had shrugged and run off, and Emma had stayed pressed against my side, making herself as small and unobtrusive as possible, her earlier excitement about attending a fancy party completely extinguished. I'd spent the entire reception watching my daughter shrink further into herself, with each passing hour, each overlooked moment, each dismissive glance from family members who should have loved her unconditionally. My chest had felt tight, my breathing shallow, as if the beautiful ballroom with its soaring ceiling had somehow run out of air. I'd kept telling myself to stay calm, to get through the evening, to not make a scene. These were the same words I'd repeated to myself for 42 years, the mantra of the perpetually accommodating, the chronically overlooked. And then had come Melissa's toast, her smirking face as she'd looked directly at Emma. The words that had cut deeper than any previous slight, because they'd been so public, so deliberately cruel, so specifically designed to humiliate a child who'd done nothing wrong except exist. The laughter that had followed had been like physical blows, each guffaw from the crowd another confirmation that my family saw my daughter as less than as other, as someone who deserved to be mocked. My mother's unmistakable cackle had risen above the rest, genuine and delighted. My father had been red-faced with mirth, his hand slapping the table as if Melissa had delivered the finest joke he'd ever heard. I'd looked down at Emma's face and had seen devastation so complete it had transcended tears. Her expression had been the same one she'd worn at 5 years old, when she'd asked me why Grandma and Aunt Melissa didn't visit us, that heartbreaking confusion of a child trying to understand why she wasn't worthy of love. My own eyes had burned with tears I couldn't shed, not here, not now. My hand had moved to my purse without conscious thought, my fingers closing around my phone, pulling it out with shaking hands. The screen had lit up in the dimness of our back corner table, bright and clear. Daniel's number had been right there in my recent calls, exactly where I'd known it would be. Every slight Emma had endured tonight had crashed over me in a wave. Every year of watching my sister be celebrated while I was dismissed. Every time my parents had chosen her happiness over basic fairness. Every moment I'd swallowed my hurt and smiled and played my role as the understanding one. 42 years of accumulated pain had crystallized into this single point of decision. My daughter's small hand had tugged at my sleeve, her voice barely audible over the continued laughter and the orchestra starting up again. "Mommy, can we go home now?" she'd asked, and in those 6 words I'd heard defeat, humiliation, and the beginning of a wound that would take years to heal if I let this moment stand unchallenged. I'd looked up from Emma's face to the head table where my parents were wiping their eyes, still chuckling. Melissa had been leaning back in her chair with that satisfied smirk, looking pleased with herself, basking in the approval of her cruelty. Around us, 300 guests had been moving on with their evening, already forgetting the joke, returning to their champagne and conversations while my daughter sat drowning in shame beside me. My thumb had pressed down on Daniel's name. The call had connected, and in that moment, everything had changed. Daniel answered on the first ring, his voice professional and calm. "Ms. Chen." He didn't ask if I was sure, didn't question my judgment, didn't try to talk me out of it. He simply waited. I took one breath, looked at my daughter's tear-stained face one more time, and spoke 3 words that would alter the course of the evening irrevocably. "Pack for donation." "Understood," Daniel replied immediately. "Stay where you are." The call ended. For about 30 seconds, nothing seemed to change. The orchestra continued playing a waltz, couples swayed on the dance floor, waiters circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Melissa was laughing with her new husband at the head table. My parents were posing for photos with guests. It was still a beautiful, perfect wedding reception. And then, as if someone had thrown a switch, everything stopped. The music cut off mid-phrase, the violinist's bow freezing on the strings. The sudden silence was so complete that I heard the click of high heels on marble, the rustle of evening gowns, someone's surprised gasp. Every head in the ballroom turned toward the orchestra platform where Daniel now stood, having materialized seemingly from nowhere. He was holding a microphone, his expression professionally neutral, but his posture radiating absolute authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "this event has been terminated per contract clause 7.3. I'm going to need everyone to exit the venue in an orderly fashion. Please leave your table settings and move toward the main doors. Thank you for your cooperation." For a moment, nobody moved. The guests simply stared confused, waiting for the punchline that would explain this bizarre interruption. Then the kitchen doors swung open and 20 staff members emerged in a coordinated wave. They were wearing latex gloves and carrying clear plastic storage containers, moving with the swift efficiency of a practiced team. They fanned out across the ballroom, approaching each table, and began systematically removing plates, boxing up food, collecting centerpieces. That's when the chaos began. Melissa's scream cut through the stunned silence like a knife. "What are you doing?" She'd leapt to her feet, her wedding dress billowing around her as she rushed toward Daniel. "You can't do this. This is my wedding." Her face had gone from bridal glow to blotchy red in seconds, her carefully applied makeup already starting to run as angry tears formed. My mother was right behind her, moving faster than I'd seen her move in years. "Stop this right now," she shrieked at Daniel, her voice shrill with panic. "This is my daughter's wedding. I don't know what kind of mistake this is, but you need to fix it immediately." She grabbed at his arm, trying to physically pull him away from the microphone, but he stepped smoothly aside, maintaining his professional composure. Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out a tablet. With a few taps, he'd connected it to the ballroom's projection system, and suddenly the wall behind the head table lit up with security footage from 20 minutes earlier. There was Melissa at the microphone, There was her smirk, and then her voice crystal clear through the sound system. "You know what they say, right? Adopted girls eat leftovers." The audio captured every word, captured the laughter that followed, captured my mother's distinctive cackle. Some guests gasped. Others pulled out their phones, already recording this unexpected turn of events. Daniel swiped to another screen, this one displaying the contract in crisp black text. He zoomed in on Section 7.3, the clause I'd crafted so carefully with Jennifer's help. "The primary signatory," he read aloud in that same calm professional tone, "reserves the right to terminate event immediately upon documented harassment or humiliation of primary signatory or their legal dependents by secondary parties or their guests." He scrolled down to the signature page where my father's distinctive scrawl was clearly visible along with my mother's neat cursive and Melissa's dramatic flourish. Signed by both secondary parties on March 15th of this year. My father had gone pale, all the laughter drained from his face. He was staring at the screen as if trying to will the signatures to disappear. "But we didn't. I never read." He started, his voice trailing off as he realized how that sounded. The staff worked with remarkable speed and grace. They were packing the elaborate 5-tier wedding cake into special boxes, wrapping each layer in protective covering. The ice sculptures were being carefully drained and moved onto dollies. Every bottle of wine, every champagne flute, every linen napkin was being collected and inventoried. Daniel moved to the microphone again as guests began gathering their belongings and moving toward the exits, many of them filming with their phones, others whispering furiously to each other. "Per the contract," Daniel announced, "all items are being donated to Harbor House Children's Home. The facility has already been contacted and has expressed their gratitude for this generous contribution." His eyes found mine across the ballroom, and there was something in his expression that told me he understood exactly what this moment meant, that he was honoring not just a contract, but a promise made to my grandmother's memory. Guests filed out in clusters, some looking scandalized, others appearing almost entertained by the drama. I heard fragments of conversation as they passed near our table. "Did you hear what she said about that child? I can't believe they signed without reading it. Good for her, honestly." Within 20 minutes, the once crowded ballroom had emptied out. The staff had removed almost everything, leaving behind only empty tables and the echoing silence of the vast space. Melissa had collapsed into a chair near the head table, her elaborate hairstyle falling apart, mascara streaming down her face in black rivers, her hands clutching at her dress. Marcus stood awkwardly beside her, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. My mother turned to face me, her whole body trembling with rage and shock. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Her voice shook so badly she could barely get the words out. "You've humiliated us. You've destroyed your sister's wedding. This is unforgivable." I stood up, lifted Emma into my arms, even though she was getting big for it, and felt her wrap her legs around my waist and bury her face in my neck. I walked past my parents, past my sobbing sister, past the debris of the evening's destruction, heading for the door where Daniel stood waiting. As I reached him, I turned back one last time to look at my family. "Yes," I said, my voice steady and clear in the empty ballroom. "I just kept my promise." The drive home had been silent except for Emma's occasional sniffles from the back seat. I'd carried her into our apartment, helped her out of her pink dress and into her pajamas, and tucked her into bed with her favorite stuffed rabbit. She'd fallen asleep almost immediately, exhausted from the emotional toll of the evening. I'd stood in her doorway for a long time, watching her chest rise and fall with each breath, feeling the adrenaline that had sustained me through the last few hours beginning to drain away. My phone had started buzzing around 9 o'clock. Text messages, one after another, lighting up my screen in rapid succession. My father: "You will be hearing from our lawyer. This is unconscionable." My mother: "How dare you embarrass us like this? You've ruined your sister's life." Melissa: "I hope you're happy. You're a vindictive, bitter woman, and I never want to speak to you again." And then more from my father: "You'll be sued for everything you have. Breach of contract, emotional distress. "We'll take your house." The messages kept coming, each one more threatening than the last, but I noticed that none of them acknowledged what had actually happened, what had been said about Emma, what had triggered the clause they'd signed. I'd waited until the barrage slowed, then I'd walked to my home office and retrieved the file labeled Melissa's Wedding. I'd scanned every page of the contract, including the signature pages with their dates and initials, and emailed the complete PDF to Jennifer with a brief message: "Used the clause tonight. Expect I'll need documentation that this was legal. Can you review?" I'd hit send and tried to settle my nerves with a cup of tea, but my hands had been shaking too badly to hold the mug steady. Jennifer had called 47 minutes later. I'd seen her name on my screen and had answered immediately, putting her on speaker so I could pace while we talked. "Sarah," she'd said, and I could hear the mixture of concern and something else in her voice, something that sounded almost like admiration. "I just read through everything. Tell me exactly what happened." I'd recounted the evening in as much detail as I could remember, my voice catching only when I described Emma's face the way she'd asked if we could go home. "Okay," Jennifer had said when I'd finished, and I'd heard the sound of papers rustling on her end. "Listen to me carefully. This contract is ironclad. You are the primary signatory, which means you had full authority to terminate the event. You had documented cause, which is explicitly defined in the clause as harassment or humiliation of you or your legal dependents. There's security footage, correct?" I'd confirmed that Daniel had shown it to everyone. "Then you have incontrovertible evidence. They signed this contract agreeing to these exact terms. They have zero legal standing to sue you. Zero. If they try, they'll lose, and they'll pay your legal fees on top of everything else." The relief had been so intense, I'd had to sit down on my office floor, my back against the desk phone still pressed to my ear. "They're threatening to take my house," I'd said, my voice small. Jennifer had made a dismissive sound. "They can threaten whatever they want. Threats are free. But no lawyer worth their bar card would take this case once they see this contract and that footage. Your family is angry and embarrassed and they're lashing out, but legally they don't have a leg to stand on." And she'd continued, her voice taking on the precise, analytical tone she used when explaining complex legal matters. "The venue's security system captured everything, right? Audio and video. I'd confirmed it had. Then the manager will have archived that footage as evidence per the contract clause. That's standard procedure for terminations with cause. But even beyond that, you said guests were filming." I'd remembered the phones, dozens of them, pointed at the head table at Daniel at the contract on the screen. "Then you have multiple independent sources of documentation. This isn't a he said, she said situation. This is a matter of public record." As if to prove her point, my own phone had buzzed with a notification while Jennifer was still talking. Someone had tagged me in a video on social media. I'd pulled up the post and found that it was from the older woman I'd noticed filming in the back of the ballroom, the one who'd given me that small nod of solidarity. She'd posted the video of Melissa's toast, the cruel comment captured in clear audio, and she'd written a caption: "When privileged people learn that contracts have consequences. This mother protected her child with preparation, not just anger. Well done." The video already had thousands of views and hundreds of comments, most of them supportive. I'd told Jennifer about the post, and she'd laughed, though there wasn't much humor in it. "Well, that's going to make things interesting. Public opinion isn't legally relevant, but it sure does affect people's willingness to pursue frivolous lawsuits when they know they'll look like the villains." We'd talked for a few more minutes about the financial aspects. Jennifer had reminded me that the contract specified all deposits were non-refundable upon termination for cause. "How much are we talking about?" she'd asked. I'd pulled up my copy of the payment schedule. $8,000 in deposits already paid. Another $6,000 in remaining balance due within 30 days. Jennifer had whistled low. "So they're out $8,000 that's already gone, and they still owe $6 more. Plus all that donated food and decorations, that's going to show up as a charitable contribution from them for tax purposes. They'll get a receipt from Harbor House listing the fair market value." I'd felt a grim satisfaction at that. The donation receipt would be a permanent reminder, an official document that would arrive in the mail showing that their cruelty had been converted into something good, something that would feed children who actually needed it. The venue estimated the food and decorations at around $12,000, I'd said. Jennifer had made a thoughtful sound. So they'll get a tax receipt for $12,000 in charitable donations they never intended to make. That's actually kind of poetic. We'd ended the call with Jennifer promising to put together a formal legal opinion letter that I could present if my family actually followed through on their threats. "But Sarah," she'd said before hanging up, "I really don't think it'll come to that. Once they calm down and actually consult with a lawyer, they'll realize they're trapped by their own signatures. They signed without reading. That's on them." I'd felt calmer after talking to Jennifer, the legal foundation of my actions confirmed and solid beneath me. I'd checked on Emma one more time, finding her still deeply asleep, her face peaceful in the glow of her nightlight. I'd been heading to my own bedroom, thinking about trying to sleep despite the adrenaline still coursing through my system when the doorbell had rung. At 11 o'clock at night, unexpected visitors were never good news. I'd walked slowly to the door, my heart rate picking up again, and peered through the peephole. A man in a dark suit stood on my doorstep holding a leather briefcase, his expression neutral and professional. "Delivery for Ms. Chen," he'd called through the door. "From Morrison Family Law." My parents had hired a lawyer already, probably within an hour of leaving the venue, and they'd sent him to my home on a Saturday night. This was only the beginning. I'd invited the lawyer in despite the late hour, offered him water, which he'd declined, and watched as he'd presented me with a letter from Morrison Family Law demanding I pay for all wedding expenses, issue a public apology, and compensate my family for emotional distress to the tune of $50,000. I'd calmly handed him a copy of the contract with Section 7.3 highlighted along with Jennifer's email confirming its validity. He'd read it twice, his expression growing increasingly uncomfortable, then had excused himself to make a phone call. When he'd returned 15 minutes later, he'd informed me that his firm would not be pursuing this matter further. "Your contract appears to be enforceable," he'd said stiffly. "I've advised your parents to consult with the attorney who reviewed the original documents." He'd left quickly after that, probably grateful to escape an unwinnable case. After he'd gone, I'd stood in my quiet living room feeling strangely unmoored. The adrenaline had finally burned off completely, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion mixed with something else, something that felt like grief. I'd acted decisively, protected my daughter, enforced consequences that were legally sound and morally justified. But I'd also just blown up my relationship with my entire family, possibly permanently. The finality of it pressed down on me as I'd locked the door and turned off the lights. I'd walked to Emma's room and stood in her doorway again, watching her sleep. She looked so peaceful, so innocent, completely unaware of the battle that had been waged on her behalf tonight. In the soft glow of her nightlight, I could see her features clearly, the slight upward tilt of her nose, the way her dark lashes fanned across her cheeks, the small hand curled under her chin, still holding on to her stuffed rabbit. She deserved to grow up knowing she was worthy of love, worthy of respect, worthy of taking up space in the world without apology. As I'd stood there, a memory had surfaced with startling clarity. I was maybe 9 years old, standing in my grandmother's kitchen on a Saturday afternoon. Nai's kitchen had been the heart of her small house, a cramped space that always smelled like garlic and ginger, and something baking in the oven. The counters had been perpetually crowded with ingredients in various states of preparation, and there had always been a pot of soup simmering on the stove because you never knew who might show up hungry. And people did show up all the time. Neighborhood children would wander in after school. Men from the homeless shelter 2 blocks away would appear around dinner time, somehow knowing they'd be welcomed. The mailman would time his route to arrive when Nai was pulling fresh bread from the oven. My grandmother had one unbreakable rule that she'd enforce with the wooden spoon she kept within easy reach. "In this house, no one eats last. Everyone gets a full plate, hot food, and respect." I'd watched her bang that spoon on the counter once when my mother had tried to set aside the best pieces of roasted chicken for family only. "What is this?" Nai had demanded in her accented English, her voice sharp. "You think some people deserve special treatment? You think some hunger is more important than other hunger. In my house, we eat together, or we don't eat at all. My mother had put the chicken back with the rest properly chastised, though I'd seen the resentment in her face. Nai had been the only person in my family who'd treated my sister and me with equal measure. When my parents had bought Melissa a car for her 16th birthday while I'd gotten a card with $20 in it for mine, my grandmother had shown up at my door 2 days later with an envelope containing savings bonds worth exactly the same amount as that car. "Your parents forget sometimes," she'd said simply. "I don't forget." When I'd graduated from college, she'd been in the front row cheering louder than anyone. When Melissa had dropped out, Nai had been disappointed but kind, offering to help her find a path forward without judgment. My grandmother had died 15 years ago, just 2 months after I'd graduated from my master's program. She'd been 78 years old and had passed quietly in her sleep, her heart simply deciding it was time to rest. I'd been 27 and devastated, feeling like I'd lost the only person who'd truly seen me, who'd believed I was worthy exactly as I was. The day before her funeral, going through her things with my mother, I'd found an envelope in her bedside table with my name on it in her distinctive handwriting. I'd held it up, confused. "What's this?" My mother had glanced over and shrugged. "She left letters for a few people. Said to give them out at specific times, but she never told me when. Just take it, I guess." I'd slipped it into my purse, intending to open it later. But when I'd gotten home and actually looked at the envelope, I'd found more of Nai's handwriting on the outside. "Open this when your family forgets who they are." The instruction had been so cryptic, so strange, that I hadn't known what to do with it. When did a family forget who they were? What did that even mean? So I'd tucked the envelope into the bottom drawer of my dresser beneath old sweaters I never wore, and I'd left it there. Through my parents' continued favoritism of Melissa, through their disapproval of my decision to adopt, through countless family gatherings, where I'd been expected to accommodate and forgive and understand. I'd thought about that envelope occasionally, but had never felt like the right moment had arrived to open it. Maybe part of me had been afraid of what it might say, afraid that even my beloved grandmother might ultimately disappoint me. But standing in Emma's doorway that night, fresh from defending my daughter's dignity and severing ties with my family in the process, I'd finally understood what Nai had meant. My family had forgotten who they were, or perhaps they'd never really been who I'd hoped they were. They'd forgotten that everyone deserves respect, that cruelty isn't humor, that a child's worth isn't determined by biology. They'd made me feel small for 42 years, and tonight they'd tried to do the same to my daughter. I'd walked to my bedroom, opened the bottom drawer of my dresser, and pulled out the envelope. It was still sealed, the paper yellowed slightly with age, my name written in the shaky hand my grandmother had developed in her final years. Beneath my name, those words, "For the day they make you small, love Nai." My hands had shaken as I'd broken the seal, 15 years of anticipation and grief and hope, making my fingers clumsy. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in my grandmother's handwriting. My hands shook as I broke the seal. I unfolded the paper with trembling fingers, the old creases threatening to tear after 15 years of being sealed away. The date at the top stopped me cold 3 weeks before my grandmother had died. She'd known she was dying when she'd written this, had known she was leaving me a message I wouldn't receive for years, maybe decades. The handwriting was shakier than I remembered, evidence of the illness that had been quietly stealing her strength, but every word was deliberate and clear. "My dearest granddaughter," it began, and I had to sit down on the edge of my bed because my legs suddenly felt unreliable. "If you're reading this, they've hurt you badly. I'm sorry I won't be there to bang my spoon and set them straight. I see how your parents favor your sister. I see how you make yourself small to keep the peace. I see how you swallow your hurt and pretend it doesn't matter. But it does matter, my sweet girl. You matter." Tears blurred my vision, and I had to pause, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand before I could continue reading. My grandmother's words reached across 15 years of silence, speaking directly to wounds I'd carried for so long I'd almost convinced myself they didn't exist. I wish I could tell you that they'll change, that one day they'll see you clearly and love you the way you deserve. But I've watched them for too many years. Some people are so busy protecting their favorite child that they forget they have another one worth protecting too. This is not your fault. This has never been your fault. The next paragraph made me sit up straighter, confusion cutting through my grief. Remember the land, the table, the recipe book. These are not just things. They're promises. The little house where I raised your father, the dining table where we fed so many people, the recipes I wrote down in my own hand. I'm leaving these to you, but not the way you think. Keep feeding people, especially when they don't deserve it. That's how you win. Not by being cruel back, but by being so generous, it shames them into seeing their own smallness. I thought about my grandmother's house, the small property on the outskirts of Seattle that I knew had been sold after her death to pay for estate expenses, or at least that's what I'd been told. And her recipe book, the worn notebook with grease-stained pages that I'd assumed had been thrown away or lost in the chaos of settling her affairs. What did she mean she was leaving these to me? And what did she mean by, not the way you think? The letter continued in that same shaky but determined hand. At the bottom of this page, you'll find a strange instruction. Follow it exactly. My video will is with Attorney Morrison. He'll contact you when the time is right, when you need it most, not when you think you want it. Trust the timing. Trust yourself. And remember, the smallest seed grows the tallest tree. You have planted something good in this world. Watch it grow. My heart had started racing. Attorney Morrison, that was the name on the letterhead of the firm that had just sent someone to my door tonight. The same firm my parents had hired to threaten me, only to have their own attorney walk away when he'd seen my contract. Was that a coincidence? It couldn't be. But how could my grandmother have known 15 years ago that this specific law firm would be involved in tonight's events? I turned the page over looking for more and found a postscript in larger letters, as if my grandmother had wanted to make absolutely sure I saw it. P.S. No one eats last, not even those who tried to make you last. You'll understand soon. Call the number I've written at the bottom. Tell them Grace Chen's granddaughter is ready. They've been waiting for you. At the very bottom of the page, written in pencil that had faded but was still legible, was a phone number with a Seattle area code. Beside it, one word, Morrison. I sat on my bed holding that letter for a long time, trying to piece together what my grandmother had orchestrated from beyond the grave. She'd died 15 years ago when I was 27 and single, and hadn't even begun thinking about adoption. She'd died before Emma existed, before tonight's catastrophe, before I'd needed whatever mysterious inheritance she'd left with Attorney Morrison. Yet somehow she'd known I would need it, had known the timing would align with a moment of crisis, had known I would finally open the envelope on a night when my family had pushed me past my breaking point. The smallest seed grows the tallest tree. I looked toward Emma's room, thinking about the tiny baby I'd held 8 years ago, thinking about the strong, kind child she was becoming despite my family's rejection. Was Emma the seed my grandmother had somehow foreseen? But that was impossible. Nai had died 7 years before I'd even begun the adoption process. I looked at the clock on my nightstand. It was nearly midnight, far too late to call anyone, much less a law office. But the letter had said, emergency line, and when you're ready, and I felt with absolute certainty that my grandmother had meant for me to call tonight, right now at this precise moment when everything had fallen apart, and I was sitting alone with her words and wondering what came next. I picked up my phone and dialed the number, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. It rang once, twice. On the third ring, a man's voice answered, alert and professional despite the hour. Morrison Family Law Attorney Morrison speaking. I took a breath. This is Sarah Chen, Grace Chen's granddaughter. I just opened her letter. There was a pause, and then the man's voice changed, becoming warmer, almost relieved. Ms. Chen, I was wondering when you'd open that letter. Your grandmother said you'd call tonight 15 years ago. She told me the exact date. She was never wrong about timing. He paused, and I heard papers rustling. Can you come to my office tomorrow at 9 a.m.? It's time you saw the video. I'd barely slept after that call with Attorney Morrison, my mind spinning with questions about what my grandmother had left behind and how she'd known with such precision when I would need it. I'd finally dozed off around 3 in the morning and woken at 7 to find Emma already awake sitting on the couch watching cartoons with unusual quietness. I'd made us both breakfast scrambled eggs and toast that neither of us had much appetite for, and was explaining that I had an important meeting when the pounding started on my front door. It was 8:15 in the morning on a Sunday. Through the peephole I could see my father's face, red and furious, his fist raised to pound again. Behind him stood my mother and Melissa, both looking haggard and wrung out. I'd taken a deep breath, steadied myself, and opened the door. They'd pushed past me without waiting for an invitation, my father's voice already raised before he'd fully entered my living room. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The entire community is talking about us. Our phones haven't stopped ringing. You've humiliated this family." Spittle flew from his mouth as he shouted, his face that dangerous shade of crimson that usually preceded one of his tirades. My mother had been crying, her makeup smeared from what looked like a sleepless night. "How could you do this to your own sister?" she'd wailed, reaching for me as if to shake some sense into my shoulders. "This was her wedding day, the most important day of her life, and you destroyed it. What kind of person does that?" Her voice had risen to a pitch that made Emma flinch on the couch, pulling her knees up to her chest. I'd noticed that Melissa hung back near the door, oddly silent. She'd looked nothing like the glowing bride from last night. Her hair was unwashed and pulled back in a messy ponytail, her face bare of makeup and blotchy from crying, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. She'd been wearing sweatpants and an oversized hoodie, and she wouldn't meet my gaze. Most tellingly, Marcus was nowhere to be seen. "Where's your husband?" I'd asked her directly, my voice cutting through my father's continued shouting. Melissa had flinched as if I'd struck her, and fresh tears had spilled down her cheeks. My father had stepped between us, blocking my view of his favorite daughter. "That's none of your business. We're here to talk about what you're going to do to fix this disaster you've created." He'd pulled out his phone, jabbing at the screen with thick fingers. "Do you know your little stunt has been viewed over 2 million times, 2 million? That woman who was filming posted it everywhere with some self-righteous caption about consequences. The comments section is full of strangers who know nothing about our family, acting like they know everything." My mother had grabbed my arm, her nails digging in through my sleeve. "The news called us. Channel 7 wants to do a story. Martha from my book club won't return my calls. Even the manager from that venue is being treated like some kind of hero for standing up for abused family members, as if you're abused. You've always been so dramatic." Sarah so ready to play the victim. I'd pulled my arm free from her grip, feeling something settle in my chest, something solid and immovable. For 42 years, I'd apologized when they were upset, had made myself smaller to accommodate their feelings, had swallowed my hurt to keep the peace. Standing in my own living room with my daughter watching, I'd felt that pattern snap like an old rotted rope, finally giving way under too much weight. "I'm not apologizing." I'd said, my voice quiet, but absolutely firm. "You laughed when my daughter was humiliated. You laughed when she was told she deserved leftovers because she's adopted. You've spent 42 years making me feel small, making me feel like I don't matter, like my feelings are less important than Melissa's comfort. That's over." My father's face had gone from red to nearly purple. "We will cut you off. You'll get nothing from us. Not a penny of inheritance, not help when you need it. Nothing." His voice had boomed through my small apartment, and I'd almost laughed at the absurdity of the threat. "Cut me off from what, Dad?" I'd asked, genuinely curious. "You've never given me anything. When I needed $500, you told me to figure it out myself. When Melissa needed $40,000 for college, she quit after a year. You paid without question. When she wrecked 3 cars, you bought her new ones. When I got promoted at work, you barely acknowledged it. So please tell me what exactly you're threatening to take away that I've ever actually had." My mother had made a desperate sound, reaching for me again. "Sarah, please, you have to make this right. Post an apology video. Tell people you overreacted, that it was a misunderstanding. Say something about being under stress, about being too sensitive. Please, people are judging us. Our reputation is being destroyed. Make this right. I'd repeated slowly, feeling the words like stones in my mouth. I protected my daughter from cruelty. I enforced a contract that you signed without reading because you were too arrogant to think consequences would ever apply to you. I didn't humiliate you. You humiliated yourselves, and you want me to lie about it to save your reputation. That's when Emma had appeared in the doorway to the living room. She'd been so quiet I hadn't realized she'd left the couch. She was still in her pajamas, the pink ones with the stars that were getting slightly too small for her hair mussed from sleep. She'd stood there holding her stuffed rabbit, looking at her grandmother and aunt with those serious, thoughtful eyes that missed nothing. "My Nai said no one eats last," she'd said in her small, clear voice that somehow carried through the entire room. "Why did you make me eat last?" The silence that fell was absolute and terrible. My father's mouth had hung open mid-breath. My mother had gone pale. Melissa had finally looked up, meeting Emma's gaze for the first time, and something in her expression had crumbled completely. My daughter had stood there waiting for an answer that none of them could give her question, hanging in the air like an indictment, simple and devastating and impossible to deflect. The room fell absolutely silent. Emma walked fully into the room, her bare feet making soft sounds on the hardwood floor. She was clutching her stuffed rabbit against her chest, the same one I'd given her the day I'd brought her home from the adoption agency 8 years ago. Its fur was matted from years of being loved, one ear slightly torn and carefully stitched back together. She stopped a few feet from my mother, tilting her head up to look at the adults who towered over her small frame. "Teacher says adopted means chosen," Emma said, her voice steady despite the tremor I could hear underneath. "She says it means someone wanted you so much they went through lots of paperwork and waiting to bring you home. Mommy chose me." She paused, her grip tightening on the rabbit. "But you didn't choose me. You never wanted me. You said I eat leftovers, but that's not what Nai taught Mommy." My mother had pressed her hand to her mouth, and I watched tears begin to stream down her face. These weren't the manipulative tears she'd deployed earlier, the ones designed to make me feel guilty and compliant. These were different, raw and involuntary, the kind that came from being confronted with a truth too ugly to deny. My father had turned away, facing the wall, his shoulders rigid. Melissa stared at the floor, her whole body shaking. Emma continued in that same clear, measured voice, speaking with a dignity that no 8-year-old should have needed to summon. "Nai taught Mommy that everybody eats first. Nobody eats last. That's what Mommy taught me too. We make sure everyone has enough. We don't make people feel bad about who they are." She looked directly at Melissa now. "You made me feel bad. You made everyone laugh at me. Why?" Melissa's face crumpled and she slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her knees pulled up to her chest, sobbing in a way that sounded like something breaking. She tried to speak but couldn't form words, just shaking her head over and over. Emma turned back to my mother. "I'm not leftovers," she said, and her voice had gotten stronger, louder. "I'm not last. And Mommy isn't last either. Mommy is the best person I know. She works hard and she's kind and she teaches me to be kind too. You should be proud of her, but you're not. You only care about Aunt Melissa. That's not fair." Out of the mouths of babes, as the saying goes. My daughter had distilled 42 years of family dysfunction into a few simple sentences that none of the adults in the room could refute. She walked over to me and took my hand, her small fingers wrapping around mine with surprising strength. "Can we go see the lawyer now?" she asked, looking up at me. "You said we had an appointment at 9. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 8:35. "Yes, sweetheart. Let's get you dressed." I looked at my parents and sister, all 3 of them, in various states of devastation. "You need to leave. Now." My father had turned back around, his face no longer red but ashen. "Sarah, we need to talk about this." "No." I said the word sharp and final. "You've said everything you came to say. You threatened me, demanded I apologize for protecting my daughter, and made it clear you care more about your reputation than about the harm you caused. There's nothing left to discuss. Please leave." As if on cue, my doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see a young man in a Grand Bellevue staff uniform standing on my porch holding an envelope. I opened the door, and he handed it to me with a polite smile. "Delivery from the venue, ma'am. Have a good day." I opened the envelope right there with my family watching. Inside was an official receipt on Harbor House Children's Home letterhead. It detailed the donation received from last night's canceled event, prepared meals that had fed 47 children, flower arrangements that had brightened their common areas, and table linens that would be used for their own upcoming fundraiser. The total fair market value of the donation was listed as $12,000. The receipt was made out to the Morrison family for tax purposes, noting that this charitable contribution was deductible under IRS guidelines. I handed the receipt to my father without a word. He read it, his hands shaking, and then passed it to my mother. I watched the realization dawn on their faces that they would receive tax documents for a charitable donation they'd never intended to make a permanent paper trail of how their cruelty had been transformed into something that fed hungry children. The IRS would have a record. Their accountant would have questions. Every year at tax time, they would remember this moment. "You need to leave," I repeated quietly. "Emma and I have somewhere to be." They filed out silently. Melissa still crying, my mother supporting her as they walked to their car. My father stopped at the door, turning back one last time. "Your grandmother would be ashamed of you," he said, trying one last manipulation. "No," I replied calmly. "She wouldn't. You're going to find that out very soon." I closed the door and helped Emma get dressed, both of us moving quickly. I was pulling on my jacket when I heard the sound of another car in the driveway. Through the window, I saw a black Mercedes pulling up, sleek and expensive-looking. An elderly man stepped out, probably in his 80s, with silver hair and a distinguished bearing. He wore a perfectly tailored suit and carried a leather briefcase that looked like it had been well used over decades. He moved slowly but with purpose, and there was something in his expression that reminded me of my grandmother, a kind of penetrating wisdom that saw through pretense. I opened the door before he could knock. "Attorney Morrison." He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Ms. Chen, and you must be Emma." He inclined his head respectfully to my daughter, who smiled shyly back. "I thought I'd save you the trip to my office. What I need to show you is better viewed in private anyway." He glanced at my small living room with its comfortable furniture and family photos. "And you'll want to sit down." Attorney Morrison had perfect timing. My family had frozen at the sound of the car in the driveway, my father halfway out the door, my mother still supporting Melissa, who'd managed to pull herself together enough to stand. When the distinguished elderly man stepped out of the black Mercedes, my father's face had gone through a remarkable transformation from ashen to confused to deeply uncomfortable. "Robert Morrison," my father had said, his voice tight. "What are you doing here?" Morrison had walked up the path with unhurried dignity, his leather briefcase in hand. "Mr. Chen, Mrs. Chen, Melissa." He'd nodded to each of them with cool professionalism. "I'm here to see my client Sarah Chen, though I suppose since you're all here, we might as well address certain matters together. May I come in?" I'd stepped back, gesturing him inside, utterly confused about what was happening. My father had reluctantly moved back into the living room, and my mother had guided Melissa to the couch. Emma had pressed close to my side, her hand still in mine, watching everything with those observant eyes. Morrison had set his briefcase on my coffee table and turned to face my parents with an expression that somehow managed to be both courteous and utterly implacable. "I understand you retained my junior partner Stevens last night, paid a $5,000 retainer to explore a lawsuit against your daughter for intentional infliction of emotional distress and breach of familial duty." My father had shifted his weight, trying to regain some authority. "That's right. What she did was unconscionable. We have grounds to sue, and we intend to pursue every legal avenue available to us." "No," Morrison had said simply. "You don't, and you won't." He'd opened his briefcase and pulled out a tablet. I've reviewed all the documentation from last night's incident. The venue's security footage, which captured both video and audio of the harassment directed at Ms. Chen's daughter. 3 separate videos recorded by guests, all showing the same event from different angles, and signed statements from 7 venue staff members who witnessed the harassment firsthand. He'd tapped the tablet and suddenly, my living room TV had come to life, mirroring his screen. There was Melissa at the microphone, there was her smirk, and then her voice. "You know what they say, right? Adopted girls eat leftovers." The audio was crystal clear. My mother's laughter rang out, my father's hand slapping the table, the room full of guests joining in. "Turn it off," my mother had whispered, but Morrison had let it play for another few seconds before stopping it. "Your daughter," he'd said, looking at my parents, "has documentation, motive, legal standing, and overwhelming public sympathy. You have spite and debt. If you sue her, she will countersue for intentional infliction of emotional distress on a minor. She will win, and the damages will likely exceed the value of your home." He'd let that sink in for a moment. "I advised Stevens to decline your case. He agreed. No reputable attorney in this city will take this case once they see this evidence." My father had sunk into a chair, all the fight draining out of him. My mother had stood frozen, her hand over her mouth. And that's when Melissa had spoken for the first time since entering my apartment. "It doesn't matter anyway," she'd said, her voice hollow and defeated. "We're broke." Everyone had turned to look at her. She'd been staring at her hands, twisting her engagement ring around her finger compulsively. "Marcus and I took out a $45,000 loan 6 months ago. He said it was for a business investment, some tech startup his friend was launching. He said we'd triple our money in a year." She'd laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. "Mom and Dad co-signed because my credit was too bad to qualify a loan. Marcus handled all the paperwork. I never even saw most of the documents." My mother had made a small sound of distress. "Melissa, what are you saying?" "The money's gone." Melissa had continued in that same flat voice. "Marcus told me last week that the investment fell through, that we'd lost everything. But I think he was lying. I think there never was an investment. The loan comes due in 90 days. First payment is almost $5,000. We don't have it. Marcus said the wedding would buy us time to figure something out, that we could enjoy one perfect day before everything fell apart." She'd finally looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "That's why he's not here. He left last night. Packed a bag while I was crying and just left. His phone goes straight to voicemail. His apartment is empty. He's gone." The room had been silent except for my mother's quiet sobbing. My father had looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. I'd felt Emma's hand tighten in mine, and I'd stroked her hair, trying to process what I was hearing. My sister's perfect wedding had been a desperate distraction from financial ruin. Her perfect fiancé had been a con artist, or a coward, or both. Morrison had waited patiently for the revelations to settle before speaking again. "I'm sorry to hear that, Melissa. Truly. But I'm afraid the situation is more complicated than you know." He'd reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a thick file folder worn at the edges as if it had been stored for a long time. "Before we discuss your grandmother's will," he'd said, looking directly at me now, "you should know something about that $45,000 loan. It wasn't secured against your parents' house as they probably believed." He'd opened the folder, revealing what looked like property deeds and loan documents. "It was secured against property that doesn't belong to your parents. It belongs to you." The words hung in the air like a physical thing, heavy and impossible. Property that belonged to me. I'd stared at Morrison, trying to make sense of what he was saying, trying to connect dots that seemed deliberately scattered. "What property? I don't own any property. I rent my apartment." Morrison had pulled out a document from the folder, a property deed yellowed slightly with age. "Your grandmother's house and the quarter-acre it sits on. She transferred it to your name 15 years ago as part of her estate distribution. The paperwork was filed with the county recorder's office 3 weeks before she died. He'd slid the deed across the coffee table toward me, and I'd picked it up with shaking hands. There it was in black and white. A property transfer from Grace Chen to Sarah Chen dated 15 years ago. The address was familiar, the small house on the outskirts of Seattle where my grandmother had lived for 30 years. I'd had vague memories of being told the house had been sold after her death to cover expenses, but here was proof that it had been given to me instead. I never knew about this, I'd whispered, staring at my own signature on the acceptance line, a signature I had no memory of making, but that was undeniably mine. Your grandmother arranged for the transfer to be handled quietly, Morrison had explained. She wanted you to have security, something of your own, but she also knew your parents would object if they knew. The property was placed in your name with a management company handling the rental arrangements. You've been receiving the rental income all these years, though it was set up to go directly into a savings account your grandmother established for you. My head had spun. A savings account I'd never known about rental income. I'd never seen a property I'd forgotten, or perhaps never fully understood was mine. But I don't receive any rental income. I've never seen any money from a property. The account was set up under your grandmother's estate initially with the funds designated for property maintenance and taxes. Any excess was to be held in trust until you needed it. Morrison had pulled out a bank statement showing an account in my name with a balance that made my breath catch. Over $80,000 accumulated over 15 years of careful management. My father had been staring at the floor, and when Morrison mentioned the property, his face had gone from ashen to gray. 2 years ago. Morrison had continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. Your father had emergency heart surgery. You signed a power of attorney document to make medical decisions on his behalf. Do you remember that? I'd nodded numbly. Of course I remembered. Dad had been terrified, convinced he might not survive the surgery. I'd rushed to the hospital with the forms his doctor had provided, signed them without reading carefully because he'd needed them immediately for the medical team to communicate with me about his care. That POA had a clause on page 6. Morrison had said, pulling out yet another document. A vague phrase about authority to manage financial accounts if medically necessary. Standard language that's usually harmless. But your father used that authorization to open a home equity line of credit against your grandmother's property. $50,000 with your property as collateral. The room had started to tilt. Emma had pressed closer to me, sensing my distress, even if she didn't understand the legal terminology. He did what? My voice had come out strangled. He told the bank he needed access to funds for his recovery, that you'd authorized him to manage your financial accounts. Technically, the POA gave him that authority, though it's highly questionable whether opening a line of credit qualifies as medically necessary financial management. Morrison had looked at my father with something approaching contempt. He borrowed $45,000 from that line of credit and gave it to Marcus Melissa's fiancé for this supposed business investment. Melissa had started crying again, but I'd barely heard her. My father had used a medical emergency, a moment when I'd signed papers out of love and fear for his life to take out a loan against property I hadn't even known I owned. He'd given my money secured by my property to a man none of us really knew for an investment that had never existed. The loan payment starts in 30 days, Morrison had continued relentlessly. $2,300 per month for 24 months. The property is the collateral. If the payments aren't made, the bank will foreclose. You'll lose your grandmother's house. I didn't know, my father had said, finally speaking, his voice barely audible. I didn't know the property was in your name. I thought it was still part of Mom's estate, that it was family property. Marcus seemed so confident, so sure the investment would pay off. I was trying to help Melissa to give her a chance at financial security. You gave away $45,000 of my money without asking me. I'd said each word deliberate and cold. You used a medical power of attorney to access my property. You put my home at risk to fund my sister's fiancé, who has now disappeared with the money. Morrison had reached into his briefcase one more time, pulling out another document, this one with official-looking seals and stamps. His expression had grown even more grave. There's more. The POA wasn't actually sufficient for the bank to approve the line of credit. They required your direct signature on the loan approval form. He'd laid the document on the table, and I'd seen my signature on the bottom line dated from 2 years ago. But I'd never signed any loan approval form. I'd never even heard about this loan until 5 minutes ago. That's not my signature, I'd started to say. But even as the words left my mouth, I'd looked more closely. It was similar to my signature, close enough that a bank clerk might not catch it, but the loops were wrong, the pressure different. Someone had copied my signature well enough to fool casual inspection but not forensic analysis. Morrison had nodded grimly. The POA wasn't enough for the bank, so they improvised. That's bank fraud, forgery, federal offense. Your father could face up to 10 years in prison. Your mother as well if she knew about it, which the timeline suggests she did. My mother had gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My father's face had gone completely white. The room had seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as the full scope of what they'd done became clear. They hadn't just taken advantage of my trust, they'd committed a crime, a felony. And they'd done it to fund my sister's relationship with a con artist who'd taken the money and run. I'd looked down at Emma, who was watching all of this with confused, worried eyes. Then I'd looked at my parents, who'd spent 42 years treating me as less important than my sister, who'd laughed when my daughter was humiliated, who'd now stolen from me and forged my signature, and put my property at risk, all while thinking they were entitled to do so, because family helped family, even when the help only ever flowed in one direction. You could press charges, Morrison had said quietly, and I'd heard the unspoken question in his voice. This was my choice. I could send my own parents to prison. I could let them face the full legal consequences of what they'd done. Or, Morrison had continued reaching for the worn folder he'd brought with him, the one that had been sitting in his office for 15 years. We could discuss your grandmother's video, Will, because it changes everything. Morrison had pulled a laptop from his briefcase, the kind that looked expensive and well-maintained, despite obvious age. Your grandmother recorded this video 3 weeks before she died. She gave it to me with very specific instructions about when it should be viewed. She said you'd know when the time was right and that I should trust your timing. He'd opened the laptop and positioned it on the coffee table so everyone in the room could see the screen. She also said that your family should see this. All of them. He'd pressed play, and suddenly my grandmother's face had filled the screen. The video quality was older, slightly grainy, but clear enough that I could see every detail. She'd been sitting in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd fed so many people, where I'd learned to chop vegetables and measure flour, and understand that feeding people was an act of love. She'd worn her favorite apron, the one with faded flowers that she'd refused to replace even when my mother had bought her new ones. Her wooden spoon, worn smooth from decades of use, lay on the table in front of her. She'd looked directly into the camera with those sharp, knowing eyes that had always seemed to see through any pretense. "Hello, my loves," she'd said, and hearing her voice again after 15 years had made my throat close up. Emma had leaned forward, fascinated, even though she'd never met the woman on the screen. "If you're watching this, something bad happened. Sarah opened my letter. That means they hurt her, and probably hurt a child." My grandmother's eyes had glistened with tears, but her expression had been fierce. "Shame on you. Shame on all of you who forgot what family means, who forgot that love isn't a pie where one person getting more means someone else gets less." My mother had made a choked sound. My father had closed his eyes. Melissa had stared at the screen as if hypnotized. Grandma had continued, her voice taking on that tone she'd used when teaching important lessons, when she'd wanted to make absolutely sure we understood. The house, the land, the savings account that's been collecting rental income all these years, I left it all in trust for my eldest granddaughter, Sarah, as the trustee. She's responsible. She's kind. She knows how to make hard choices with grace. She'd paused, letting that sink in. But the property doesn't belong to her. Not really. It belongs to whoever she chooses, the grandchild who shows the most kindness, whether born to this family or chosen by love. I'd felt my eyes widen, my breath catching. Beside me, Emma had looked up at me with confused hope in her expression. On the screen, my grandmother had leaned forward slightly, as if she wanted to make absolutely certain we heard every word. "I don't care about blood," Grandma had said, her voice strong and clear. "I never did. I care about character. I care about who shows up for people who need them. I care about who makes room at the table for everyone who remembers that no one eats last." She'd picked up her wooden spoon, holding it like a scepter. The grandchild who learns these values, who lives them, who makes them real in the world. That's who gets my house, my land, my legacy. Melissa had gasped, a sound of pure devastation. She'd finally understood that the grandmother she'd taken for granted, whose love she'd assumed was automatic and unconditional, had been watching all along, had been taking notes, had been making decisions about what mattered. Grandma's voice had grown firmer, taking on the authority she'd wielded in her kitchen when laying down rules that couldn't be negotiated. "There's one condition: this grandchild must be able to cook my apple pie recipe from memory. Not reading from a card, not following written instructions. From memory. Because memory means you've done it enough times that it's part of you, that you've learned it in your hands and your heart." She'd smiled then, just a little. "When they can do that, the property transfers to their name, held in trust until age 25, until they're old enough to understand what they have and protect it." My mind had raced. Emma and I baked apple pie every Sunday. It was our ritual, our special time together. I'd taught her my grandmother's recipe the same way Nai had taught me, by doing it over and over until the measurements became instinct, until the feel of the dough was something you knew in your fingers. Emma could make that pie with her eyes closed. She knew to add just a splash of lemon juice to brighten the apples, to use cold butter cut into small cubes for the perfect flaky crust, to brush the top with cream, and sprinkle it with coarse sugar for that beautiful golden finish. The video had continued, and my grandmother's expression had hardened in a way I'd rarely seen. "And hear me clearly on this: if anyone in this family harms this child, whoever she is, they forfeit all claims to anything I left behind. Every penny goes to charity. The house gets sold. The savings get donated. You get nothing." She'd pointed her wooden spoon at the camera like a weapon. "You don't get to hurt people and profit from my life's work. You don't get to make someone feel small and then benefit from my generosity. That's not how this family works. That's not how my family works." She'd set down the spoon and folded her hands, her expression softening into something tender and sad. "No one eats last. Not in my house, not in my family. If you've forgotten that if you've made someone eat last, then you've already lost what matters most. I hope you figure that out before it's too late." The video had ended with her looking directly into the camera, and I'd felt like she was looking right at me, right into my soul, telling me that I'd done the right thing, that she was proud, that she'd known all along I would eventually find the strength to stand up. Morrison had closed the laptop gently, the click of it shutting seeming impossibly loud in the silence that followed. My mother had been crying silently, tears streaming down her face. My father sat with his head in his hands. Melissa stared at the blank screen, as if hoping it might come back to life and offer her some path back to grandmother's good graces. "Your daughter," Morrison had said, looking at me with something like admiration, "is the only grandchild, biological or adopted, under the age of 18. Your grandmother's estate is currently worth approximately $280,000. The house and property are valued at $160,000. The savings account, which has been collecting rental income and accruing interest for 15 years, holds $120,000. It's all held in trust for Emma, managed by you as trustee until she reaches age 25, assuming she can prove she learned your grandmother's values." He'd paused, and in that pause the entire world had seemed to rebalance itself. Everything my family had tried to steal, everything they'd thought they were entitled to, every advantage they'd assumed would always flow in Melissa's direction, all of it had been redirected to my daughter, the child they'd rejected, the girl they'd said ate leftovers. "Can your daughter make apple pie?" Morrison had asked, and there had been the ghost of a smile on his weathered face. I'd looked down at Emma, who was looking up at me with wide eyes, beginning to understand that something important was happening, even if she didn't grasp all the details. I'd smiled through my tears, feeling my grandmother's presence so strongly it was almost physical. "We bake it every Sunday," I'd said, my voice breaking. "She knows the recipe by heart." After Morrison had left and my family had shuffled out in stunned silence, I'd sat with Emma on the couch for a long time, holding her close and thinking about what my grandmother had done. She'd seen 15 years into the future, had anticipated pain I hadn't yet experienced, had protected a child she'd never met. The weight of that love, that foresight, that absolute faith in my character had been almost overwhelming. I could have reveled in the vindication, could have celebrated the fact that my family's cruelty had backfired so spectacularly. But sitting there with my daughter, I'd heard my grandmother's voice as clearly as if she'd been in the room. "Keep feeding people, especially when they don't deserve it. That's how you win." So instead of gloating, instead of closing ranks and shutting my family out completely, I'd done what my grandmother would have done. I'd planned a feast. I'd withdrawn $5,000 from my savings account and started making calls. The elderly couple who'd been renting my grandmother's house, a sweet pair named Harold and Diane, who I'd only met twice in passing years ago, had answered on the first ring when I'd called to explain my idea. "Oh, honey," Diane had said, her voice warm and delighted. "Your grandmother would be so proud. Of course you can use the house. When do we start cooking?" I'd called the event "No One Eats Last a Celebration of Grace Chen," and had sent invitations to everyone I could think of. The neighbors who'd known my grandmother, the families from Harbor House Children's Home, who'd received the donated wedding food guests from the local homeless shelter, Emma's school friends and their families. And yes, I'd sent invitations to my parents and Melissa too, though I hadn't heard back from them. Daniel Park had called me the day after I'd posted about the event on social media. "Ms. Chen, I saw your announcement. I'd like to help." His voice had carried that same quiet determination it had held when he'd shut down the wedding. "Your grandmother did so much for me. Let me give back." By the end of that conversation, he'd committed not just himself but 15 of his staff members who'd volunteered to spend their Sunday off cooking and serving. "We'll prepare everything," he'd insisted. "You just show up with your daughter and let us honor Mrs. Chen the way she deserves." The day of the feast had dawned clear and bright, one of those perfect Seattle autumn days where the air smelled like fallen leaves and possibility. I'd arrived at my grandmother's house early, with Emma, both of us carrying boxes of supplies. The house looked exactly as I remembered it from childhood, a small craftsman bungalow with a wide front porch and flower beds that Diane had clearly been maintaining with love. Harold had opened the door before we'd even knocked, his face creased in a huge smile. Come in, come in. We've been preparing all week." He'd led us into the kitchen and I'd stopped in the doorway completely overwhelmed. The kitchen was spotless and gleaming, every surface scrubbed, but more than that, it was exactly as my grandmother had left it. The same old stove that she'd cooked on for 30 years now, cleaned and serviced, but clearly still functional. Her heavy cast-iron pans hanging from hooks above the counter. Her wooden spoons standing in the ceramic crock she'd brought from China. Even her recipe cards protected in plastic sleeves, organized in a wooden box on the windowsill. "How?" I'd managed to say, running my fingers over the worn handle of her favorite spatula. Diane had come up beside me, wiping her hands on an apron. "Your grandmother visited me in a dream the night she died," she'd said matter-of-factly, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. I'd never met her, you understand. We moved in 2 weeks after she passed, got the rental through a management company. But that first night I slept here, she appeared clear as day. Said, "Take care of my house. My granddaughter will need it someday to feed people." She showed me where she kept everything, told me not to let the management company clear out the kitchen. Harold had nodded, taking up the story. "We told the property managers that we'd keep the kitchen equipment as part of our rental agreement, that we'd maintain it ourselves. They thought we were eccentric, but they didn't care. We've been paying below market rent for 15 years, keeping everything exactly as she wanted it." He'd smiled at Emma, who was staring at all of them with wide eyes. We've been waiting for you." By 10 in the morning, Daniel and his team had arrived in 3 vans loaded with ingredients. They'd moved through the kitchen with professional efficiency, some preparing my grandmother's dumpling recipe, others working on her famous roasted chicken with scallions and ginger, still others rolling out dough for spring rolls. The house had filled with the smells of my childhood garlic and sesame oil and star anise, and I'd found myself crying as I helped chop vegetables alongside Daniel. "She was always cooking for an army," I'd told him, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. "She said you never knew who might show up hungry. Turned out she was feeding people's souls as much as their bodies." Local press had somehow gotten wind of the event. A reporter from the community paper had shown up with a photographer, and I'd given them a brief interview while Emma helped roll dumpling wrappers under Diane's patient instruction. "Woman honors grandmother by feeding community after family betrayal" would be the headline in the next day's paper, though I didn't know that yet. What I knew was that the story of the canceled wedding had somehow transformed into something larger, a narrative about the power of generosity to redeem even the ugliest situations. By noon, people had started arriving. Families from the neighborhood, many of whom remembered my grandmother and had stories to share about meals she'd fed them during hard times. The children from Harbor House, accompanied by their caregivers, shy at first, but growing bolder when they saw Emma waving at them. Guests from the homeless shelter, some of whom Daniel knew from his own time on the streets years ago. Emma's teacher and several of her classmates with their parents. Within an hour, 150 people filled the house and spilled out into the yard, where Harold and I had set up folding tables borrowed from the church down the street. I'd been carrying a platter of dumplings to one of the outdoor tables when I'd heard a car pull up. I'd turned to see Melissa getting out of a sedan alone, her face puffy from crying. She'd been wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt, no makeup, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She'd looked small and lost, and so different from the glowing bride of a week ago that I'd almost not recognized her. Behind her car, a police cruiser had pulled up to the curb. My stomach had dropped. An officer had gotten out a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense expression. She'd approached me directly, having clearly identified me somehow. "Ms. Chen, Sarah Chen." She'd waited for my nod. "I'm Officer Patricia Winters. We need to talk about your sister's fiancé, Marcus Webb. We found him." She'd glanced at the crowd of people at Emma, who was watching from the porch. "And you're not going to believe where." Officer Winters had gestured for me to step away from the crowd, and I'd followed her to the edge of the yard where we could speak privately. Melissa had trailed behind us, her arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to hold her body together. "Marcus Webb was arrested at SeaTac Airport yesterday afternoon." The officer had begun pulling out a small notebook. "He was attempting to board a flight to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. TSA flagged him during secondary screening when they found $38,000 in cash bundled in his checked luggage." I'd felt the number hit me like a physical blow. $38,000. Not all of the $45,000 he'd stolen, but close. He'd been running with money that was technically mine, secured against my property through fraud and deception. "He's being charged with wire fraud and theft by deception," Officer Winters had continued. "The FBI is involved because of the interstate banking elements. But there's more. Immigration and Customs Enforcement has flagged him as well. Turns out Marcus Webb isn't his real name. His visa status is questionable at best. His passport shows he entered the country on a student visa 8 years ago, but there's no record of him maintaining enrollment or changing his status. His entire identity in the United States appears to be partially fabricated." Melissa had made a sound like something dying. I'd turned to look at her and watched as her legs gave out. She'd collapsed onto my grandmother's porch steps, her body folding in on itself, sobs tearing from her throat in a way that sounded like they were being ripped from somewhere deep inside. These weren't the practiced tears she'd used so many times to manipulate our parents into giving her what she wanted. These were raw and ugly and real, the tears of someone whose entire understanding of their life had just shattered. "I'm so stupid," she'd gasped between sobs, her hands covering her face. "I'm so incredibly stupid. He said he loved me. He said we'd start a business together, that we'd build something real. He talked about our future like it was already happening, like it was inevitable. And I believed everything. Every word. Every promise. Officer Winters had given me a look that was part sympathy, part professional distance, and had handed me her card. "You'll need to come down to the station to give a statement about the fraudulent loan. We'll need documentation of the power of attorney and the forged signature. Your attorney can be present if you'd like." She'd glanced at Melissa, still crumpled on the steps. "Your sister will need to give a statement as well. She's a victim here too, though that doesn't excuse the role she played in the loan arrangement." After the officer had left, I'd stood looking down at my sister, feeling a complicated tangle of emotions I couldn't quite name. Anger was there certainly. Satisfaction that consequences were finally catching up to the golden child who'd glided through life while I'd struggled. But underneath those sharper feelings was something else, something that felt uncomfortably like pity. Melissa looked up at me. Then her face, blotchy and swollen mascara she'd apparently put on that morning, streaked in black rivers down her cheeks. "You tried to warn me," she'd said, her voice hoarse. "Last year, remember? When I first started dating him. You asked me if I'd met his family, if I'd seen where he lived, if I knew anything about his background. You said something felt off about him, that he was too smooth, too perfect. And I called you jealous. I said you couldn't stand to see me happy. I said you'd been bitter ever since you couldn't find a man of your own." She'd laughed then, a horrible, bitter sound. "God, I was such a bitch to you. And you were right. You were right about everything." From inside the house, I could hear laughter and conversation, the sound of a community coming together exactly as my grandmother would have wanted. Children were playing in the yard. Emma's voice rose above the others, excited and happy, explaining something about dumplings to one of her school friends. The air smelled like my grandmother's cooking, like home, like everything good that could exist when people chose generosity over cruelty. And here on the porch steps sat my sister, destroyed by her own choices and the choices of a man who'd seen her as nothing more than a means to an end. I'd gone back into the kitchen and filled 2 plates with food. Dumplings, roasted chicken, spring rolls, rice, and a slice of apple pie that Emma had helped make. I'd carried them out to the porch, and Melissa had looked up at me with red, confused eyes when I'd extended one of the plates toward her. "Come inside," I'd said quietly. "No one eats last." She'd taken the plate with shaking hands, staring at it as if she couldn't quite comprehend what was happening. For a long moment, she hadn't moved, just sat there holding the warm plate, while tears continued to run down her face. I'd started to turn back toward the house, assuming she'd follow when she was ready, when her voice stopped me. "I'm pregnant." The words had come out barely above a whisper, but they'd hit me with the force of a shout. I turned back slowly, and Melissa was still staring at the plate of food, not meeting my eyes. 3 months. She'd continued, her voice hollow and defeated. "I found out 2 weeks before the wedding. Marcus knew. I told him the night I took the pregnancy test, and he seemed happy at first. Talked about how we'd be a family, how the baby would be the start of our new life together. But looking back now, I think that's when he started planning to leave. He knew he'd have to run soon before I started showing, before there were more complications." She'd finally looked up at me, and the devastation in her eyes was complete. "He ran anyway. He knew about the baby, and he ran with the money, and he never looked back." I'd sat down on the step beside her, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel my presence. Inside, someone had started playing music, something soft and cheerful that drifted out through the open windows. "I have nothing," Melissa had whispered. "No job, no money, no home. Mom and Dad can't help me because of the debt, because of what they did with your property. They might lose their house over this. And I'm going to have a baby in 6 months, and I have absolutely no idea how I'm going to take care of it." She'd set the plate down carefully on the step beside her, as if her hands were too unsteady to hold it safely. "I need to ask you something, and I know I have no right. I know I don't deserve anything from you after what I've done, after how I've treated you your whole life, after what I said about Emma at my wedding." She'd turned to face me fully, then tears still streaming, her voice breaking. "But I don't know where else to go." I hadn't answered Melissa immediately. I'd sat there on the porch steps beside her watching the community feast my grandmother had somehow orchestrated from beyond the grave, and I'd felt the weight of what she was asking settle over me. She wanted help. She wanted me to save her from the consequences of choices she'd made, choices that had directly harmed me and my daughter. And part of me, the part that had spent 42 years being the responsible one who cleaned up everyone else's messes, wanted to say yes immediately, just to make the uncomfortable moment end. But before I could formulate any kind of response, I'd noticed the older woman from the wedding making her way through the crowd toward us. She'd been distinctive even in the sea of guests, wearing an elegant charcoal blazer over dark jeans. Her silver hair cut in a sharp bob that framed her angular face. She'd moved with purpose, and when she'd reached the porch, she'd extended her hand to me with a warm, professional smile. "Sarah Chen, I'm Helen Vega. I wonder if I might have a moment of your time." Her voice had been cultured, confident, the voice of someone used to asking difficult questions and getting honest answers. She'd glanced at Melissa with something that looked like sympathy, but hadn't addressed her directly. I'd stood shaking her hand, noting the strength in her grip. "You were at the wedding," I'd said. "You filmed everything." "I did." Helen had reached into her bag and pulled out a business card, handing it to me. It read, "Helen Vega, Senior Producer, Family Matters, Investigative Series, Como News." She'd seen my expression change as I'd read it. "I need to be transparent with you. I wasn't at your sister's wedding as a guest. I was there working." Melissa had looked up sharply at that, her tears momentarily forgotten. "Working? What do you mean, working?" Helen had turned to her with professional courtesy but no warmth. "I produce an investigative documentary series called Family Matters. For the past 3 years, we've been documenting cases of elder abuse, financial exploitation, and emotional abuse within families. 6 weeks before your wedding, I received an anonymous tip that your family had a long-standing pattern of emotional abuse directed at your older sister, and that you were planning a large public event where this dynamic might play out." She'd looked back at me. "I attended to observe and document. What I captured was far worse than I'd anticipated." I'd felt a strange mixture of violation and vindication. Someone had reported my family. Someone had thought the situation was serious enough to contact a television producer. "Who sent the tip?" I'd asked. Helen had smiled slightly. "Anonymous means anonymous. But I can tell you it came from someone who'd witnessed the family dynamic for years and felt it needed to be exposed." She'd pulled out a tablet from her bag similar to the one Morrison had used. "May I show you what I have?" We'd moved to a quiet corner of the yard away from the main crowd. Melissa had followed, and Helen hadn't objected. On the tablet, Helen had pulled up file after file. The wedding footage, of course, crystal clear and damning, but also interviews she'd conducted with venue staff in the days following the cancellation. Daniel speaking thoughtfully about my grandmother's legacy and how he'd felt honored to help me enforce the contract. 3 different guests from the wedding all speaking on camera about how uncomfortable they'd felt during Melissa's toast, how inappropriate it had been. "But there's more," Helen had said, swiping to another folder. "After your story went viral, people started reaching out to me. Old neighbors of yours. People who remembered your family from when you were children." She'd played a video of an elderly woman I vaguely recognized from my childhood neighborhood. "I remember those girls," the woman had said to the camera. "The younger one, Melissa, she was always in pretty dresses, always getting attention. But Sarah, she was the one doing chores, watching her sister, never getting the same treatment. Their grandmother, Grace, she used to talk to me about it. Said it broke her heart watching her son play favorites like that." Another video had shown a man who'd been my high school guidance counselor. "Sarah Chen was one of the brightest students I ever worked with. Full scholarship potential. But her parents wouldn't help with application fees for out-of-state schools. Said they needed to save money. Then the next year they sent her younger sister to private school. I've never forgotten that." Helen had paused the videos and looked at me intently. "This is a story about inheritance, Sarah. Not just money, but values. How cruelty gets passed down through generations, and how one person with courage can break that cycle." I'd like to air a 15-minute segment on family matters. It would include the wedding footage, these interviews, information about your grandmother's video, will, and coverage of this feast you've organized today. I believe it could help thousands of women in similar situations understand that they're not alone, that setting boundaries isn't cruelty, it's survival. I'd looked around at the feast happening in my grandmother's yard. Children were running through the grass, laughing and playing without any awareness of the complicated adult drama swirling around them. Emma was showing a group of kids from Harbor House how to fold dumpling wrappers, her face serious with concentration as she demonstrated the technique. An older homeless man I'd seen earlier had tears running down his face as a volunteer offered him a second helping, as if the simple act of being asked if he wanted more food was more than he'd dared hope for. My grandmother's house was alive again, filled with exactly the kind of generous chaos she'd always created. "I need your permission," Helen had said, her voice gentle but businesslike. "This will make your family's cruelty very public. Your parents, your sister, they'll all be recognizable. The video has already gone viral, yes, but a produced documentary segment is different. It's permanent. It's official. It's journalism, not just social media." She'd glanced at Melissa, who'd gone pale. "But it will also show your daughter your grandmother's legacy, this beautiful thing you're doing today. It's your choice. I won't air anything without your explicit consent." I'd been about to respond, my mind still processing the implications, when I'd heard my mother's voice cutting through the crowd. She'd been pushing through the guests with my father behind her, both of them looking agitated and out of place among the relaxed, happy people filling the yard. My mother's face had been tight with panic when she'd spotted Helen's tablet, had seen what was displayed on the screen. "Don't you dare air that footage!" my mother had hissed, her voice low and venomous as she'd approached us. She'd jabbed her finger at Helen, her whole body vibrating with fury. "I'll sue you for defamation. I'll sue this whole television station. You have no right to film private family moments and broadcast them to the world. This is harassment. This is invasion of privacy. This is—" "Actually, ma'am," Helen had interrupted smoothly, her voice calm and professional in contrast to my mother's rising hysteria. "Truth is an absolute defense against defamation. Everything I filmed is factual. Everything in my interviews is corroborated by multiple sources. And I have signed release forms from everyone who was at that wedding and agreed to be filmed." She'd pulled up another file on her tablet showing a long list of names with digital signatures beside them. The venue required all guests to sign media releases because they use events for promotional purposes. Everyone agreed they could be filmed and that the footage could be used in various contexts. Everyone except you, actually. You and your husband were so focused on the wedding arrangements that you never bothered to read what you were signing. My mother's face had gone from red to white. That's entrapment or something. That can't be legal." "It's completely legal," Helen had said. "Standard practice for event venues. You gave permission to be filmed. You just didn't bother to read what you were agreeing to. Much like the contract your daughter signed for this venue, actually. There seems to be a pattern of your family not reading documents before signing them." My father had stepped forward, then trying to take control with his usual bluster. "You're twisting everything, taking things out of context, making us look like monsters when we're just a normal family having normal disagreements." "Normal families," Helen had replied, her voice cooling by several degrees, "don't mock an 8-year-old child in front of 300 people. Normal disagreements don't end with one family member using forged documents to steal from another." She'd looked at me then, and her expression had been compassionate but unyielding. "The question isn't whether your family's behavior was wrong, Mr. and Mrs. Chen. The evidence is overwhelming on that point. The question is whether Sarah wants the world to see the truth, or whether she wants to continue protecting you from the consequences of your own actions." The entire feast seemed to hold its breath. Guests nearby had stopped their conversations, sensing drama, but not understanding its full context. Emma had looked over from where she'd been teaching dumpling folding, her face worried as she'd seen her grandparents confronting me. Daniel had materialized at the edge of the group, his posture protective, ready to intervene if needed. Helen had turned to face me fully, her tablet held loosely in one hand, all the evidence of my family's cruelty and my grandmother's wisdom contained in that small device. "Sarah," she'd said quietly, "what's your decision? Do I have your permission to air this story?" Before I could answer, Helen's question, Officer Winters had returned, moving through the crowd with another plainclothes detective beside her. The detective was a tired-looking man in his 50s with graying hair and sharp, observant eyes. They'd approached our tense circle with the kind of purposeful stride that meant they had more information, and from the grim set of Officer Winters' jaw, I'd known it wasn't going to be good news for my family. "Ms. Morrison," Officer Winters had said, addressing Melissa directly, "this is Detective Chen from the Fraud Division." She'd paused, seeming to register the coincidence of the name, then had continued. "We've gotten more information about Marcus Webb, or rather about the man you knew as Marcus Webb." Melissa had wrapped her arms around her middle, her face already bracing for another blow. "What now?" she'd whispered. Detective Chen had pulled out his own tablet, apparently the preferred tool of everyone delivering devastating news these days. "Marcus Webb is an alias. His real name is Arman Rashid. He's a Malaysian national who entered the United States on a student visa 8 years ago. The visa expired 6 years ago. He never left. He's been living here illegally, working under false documentation, building a completely fabricated identity." My mother had made a small, strangled sound. My father had gone very still, the kind of stillness that comes before a collapse. "There's more." Detective Chen had continued, his voice professionally neutral, but not unkind. "Mr. Rashid has a wife and 2 children in Kuala Lumpur. He's been sending them money regularly for years. The $38,000 we found in his luggage, that was meant to fund his return home and help his family relocate to a different city where they couldn't be traced. He'd been planning this for months." Melissa's legs had given out again, and this time my father had caught her, lowering her back down to the porch steps as she'd begun to hyperventilate. "A wife," she'd gasped between breaths. "He has a wife and children. This whole time, everything was a lie, everything." "His plan, as far as we can piece together," the detective had said, "was to marry you, obtain a green card through marriage fraud, then divorce you once his status was secured. The loan money was a bonus he likely hadn't anticipated. When your sister here signed that contract clause that gave Sarah the power to cancel the wedding, he apparently panicked. No wedding meant no marriage certificate, no green card application in process, and with the fraud investigation starting, he knew he had to run." Officer Winters had looked at me with something approaching respect. "If you hadn't canceled that wedding, Ms. Chen, your sister would be legally married to a con artist who was already married to someone else. That's bigamy on top of everything else. You actually saved her from an even worse situation." Helen had been recording everything on her tablet, I'd noticed, though she'd positioned herself discreetly at the edge of our group. My mother had seen it too, and had lunged toward her, but my father had grabbed her arm, holding her back. For once, he seemed to understand that making a scene would only make everything worse. "How much?" my father had asked, his voice hollow. "The debt. How much are we liable for?" Detective Chen had deferred to Officer Winters, who'd pulled out paperwork I recognized as loan documents. "Because you co-signed, and because there was fraud involved in securing the loan against property you didn't own, the bank is pursuing you for the full amount, plus penalties and legal fees. They've calculated it at $52,000. They want payment in full within 90 days, or they'll begin foreclosure proceedings on any assets they can attach." "We don't have $52,000, my mother had said, and for the first time in my life, I'd heard genuine fear in her voice. Not manipulation, not theatrical emotion, but real terror. "We have a mortgage. Our retirement accounts are small. We'd have to sell our house, and even then, with the market the way it is, we might not clear enough to pay the debt and have anything left to live on." My father had done something then that I'd never seen in 42 years. He'd started to cry. Not angry tears, not tears of frustration, but deep broken sobs that shook his whole body. He'd sunk down onto the porch steps beside Melissa, his face in his hands, and cried like a child. "We've been bad parents to you," he'd said through his tears, his voice muffled by his hands. "We know that now. We've known it for a while, but we didn't want to admit it. We treated you terribly. We dismissed you, we used you. We let Melissa get away with everything while we held you to impossible standards. And then we stole from you. We forged your name. We're criminals. We're terrible people." My mother had knelt down beside him, her own tears flowing freely. "We can't lose our house, Sarah. We have nowhere to go. We're not asking you to forgive us. We know we don't deserve that. But please, if there's any mercy in you, any compassion at all, please don't let us lose everything." I'd looked at them, really looked at them, perhaps for the first time in my adult life, without the filter of obligation or resentment clouding my vision. They looked old, suddenly older than their years. My father's face was gray with stress and shame. My mother's carefully maintained appearance had crumbled, her hair disheveled, her makeup smeared, her expensive clothes somehow looking cheap in the harsh light of consequence. Behind them, Melissa sat with her hand on her still flat stomach, pregnant and abandoned her perfect wedding. A distant memory, her perfect life revealed as an elaborate fiction. The guests at the feast had mostly gone back to their conversations and their meals, giving our family drama a respectful distance. But I'd been acutely aware that we were still in public, that this moment was being witnessed by a community that had come together to celebrate my grandmother's legacy of generosity. Emma had been watching from across the yard, her small face serious and concerned, and I'd known that whatever I decided in this moment would teach her something fundamental about justice and mercy, about consequences and compassion. Helen had stood quietly with her tablet, neither encouraging nor discouraging, simply bearing witness. Daniel had remained at the edge of our circle, his presence a silent reminder of what my grandmother had done for him when he'd been desperate and alone. The elderly couple who rented my grandmother's house. Harold and Diane had appeared on the porch, and Diane had pressed a glass of water into Melissa's shaking hands without a word. I'd thought about my grandmother's letter, her instructions to keep feeding people, especially when they didn't deserve it. I'd thought about the video will, her insistence that no one eat last, that everyone deserved dignity and a seat at the table. But I'd also thought about the years of hurt, the casual cruelty, the laughter when my daughter had been humiliated. I'd thought about the forged signature, the stolen property, the absolute assumption that I would simply absorb their mistakes and their malice without complaint or consequence. I'd looked at Helen, her camera ready to capture whatever came next. At my parents finally humbled, finally understanding what it meant to be powerless and desperate. At my sister broken and pregnant, carrying a child who would grow up knowing that actions had consequences and that family wasn't a shield against accountability. At my daughter watching everything, learning what justice looked like when it was tempered with wisdom instead of revenge. I'd taken a deep breath, feeling my grandmother's presence so strongly it was almost physical, and I'd made my decision. "I'll pay the debt," I'd said, and watched my parents' faces transform with desperate relief. But there are conditions, significant conditions, and they're non-negotiable. I'd turned to Helen, meeting her eyes directly. "And yes, Helen, you can film this, all of it. Because if this story can help other women understand that they don't have to set themselves on fire to keep their families warm, then it needs to be told." Helen had moved closer with her tablet, positioning herself to capture everything while remaining unobtrusive. My parents had looked up at me with desperate hope, mixed with dread, knowing they had no leverage, no room to negotiate, nothing to offer except their acquiescence to whatever terms I set. It was a reversal so complete that I'd seen my mother actually sway on her feet as the reality settled over her. "First condition," I'd said, my voice steady and clear enough to carry to the gathered guests who'd gone quiet, sensing that something important was happening. "You will film a full, unequivocal apology to my daughter. Not to me, to Emma. You will take responsibility for years of treating her as less than family, and you will specifically address the leftovers comment from the wedding. You will say on camera, 'We were wrong. Adoption is love. This child is family. We are sorry.' The video will be posted on your personal social media accounts where your friends and community can see it, and it will be included in Helen's documentary. My mother had opened her mouth to object, her face already forming the familiar expression of wounded dignity she'd always used when asked to admit fault. But I'd looked at her, really looked at her, with 42 years of accumulated authority behind my gaze, and she'd closed her mouth again without speaking. My father had simply nodded his head, hanging in defeat. Second condition. I'd continued feeling the shape of my grandmother's plan becoming clear as I spoke. Grandmother's house will be converted into Grace's Table, a community kitchen open 3 days a week. Harold and Diane have already agreed to stay on as residents and caretakers. The three of you, I gestured to my parents and sister, will volunteer there as staff members, cooking, serving, cleaning, whatever is needed. Minimum 15 hours per week for 2 years. You will work under the supervision of Daniel Park, who I'm hiring as the director. Daniel had stepped forward then, his expression serious but not unkind. I accept the position, he'd said quietly, and I'll make sure the work is real. No special treatment, no shortcuts. You'll serve the community with the same dignity and respect that Mrs. Chen always showed. My mother had made a sound of protest. We're not servants, we can't be expected to. You stole from me. I'd interrupted, my voice sharp enough to cut through her objection. You forged my signature. You used my property to fund a con artist. You laughed when my daughter was humiliated. The alternative to these conditions is bankruptcy, possible criminal prosecution, and losing your home anyway. So yes, you can be expected to volunteer at a community kitchen. Many people do it because they believe in service. You'll do it because you have to learn what it means to serve instead of being served. Melissa had been the one to speak then, her voice small and defeated. Where am I supposed to live? I don't have anywhere to go. The apartment was Marcus's, or whoever he really was. I can't afford rent. I'm pregnant and unemployed. I'd looked at her, at the sister who'd tormented me for decades, who'd been the golden child while I'd been the afterthought, and I'd felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of something that might eventually become compassion. Third condition, I'd said. Melissa, you can live in Grandma's house rent-free, while you're pregnant and for 1 year after the baby is born. But you will help run Grace's Table. You will participate in prenatal care and parenting classes. Harold and Diane will live in the separate apartment above the garage, and they'll be there to help you, but also to make sure you're following through. Melissa had stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. You're letting me live there? Why would you do that? Because my grandmother believed no one should eat last, I'd said simply. Not even people who've made terrible choices. And because that baby you're carrying didn't do anything wrong. That child deserves a chance. I'd turned back to my parents. As for you two, you can keep your home, but you'll make monthly payments to me of $500 for 10 years. That's $60,000 total, covering the debt, plus the pain and suffering you've caused. You'll also complete 200 hours of community service beyond your work at Grace's Table. Hospital volunteering, literacy tutoring, whatever you choose, but it has to be documented and verified. My father had been nodding before I'd even finished, his eagerness to accept almost pathetic. Yes. Yes, we'll do all of it, whatever you want. These aren't suggestions, I'd said, pulling out my phone and texting Jennifer quickly. My attorney will draw up a formal contract. Everything I've just said will be legally binding. If you violate any term, the full debt becomes due immediately, and I'll pursue criminal charges for the forgery. The contract will be notarized. You'll sign it in front of witnesses. And if you ever treat Emma with anything less than respect and love, every single one of these agreements becomes void, and you'll face the full consequences. Helen had been recording the entire exchange, her expression professional, but I'd caught something in her eyes that looked almost like awe. Detective Chen and Officer Winters had remained as well, bearing witness to what was essentially a restorative justice agreement being hammered out in real time in my grandmother's yard. When do we start? Melissa had asked, her hand still resting protectively on her stomach. At Grace's Table, I mean. As soon as the renovations are complete, I'd said. I'm using part of the inheritance to upgrade the kitchen to commercial standards, to add accessibility features to make it a real community space. Should take about 6 weeks. You can move into the house next week. Harold and Diane will help you get settled. And Melissa?" I'd waited until she met my eyes. "This is a chance. Probably the last one you're going to get. Don't waste it." Jennifer had arrived within 20 minutes. Apparently, she'd been at a coffee shop nearby when I'd texted. She'd brought her laptop and a portable printer, and we'd moved into my grandmother's dining room where she'd pulled up a contract template and begun customizing it with the terms I'd outlined. My parents, Melissa, Helen, Daniel, and the 2 police officers had all crowded into the small room watching as the document took shape. The contract had been thorough and unforgiving. Every condition was spelled out in precise legal language. The payment schedule, the work requirements, the housing arrangement, the consequences for violation. Jennifer had included clauses about Emma's treatment, about cooperation with Helen's documentary, about access to Emma that I could revoke at any time if they stepped out of line. When she'd finally hit print, the contract had been 12 pages long. "This is incredibly fair given what they did," Jennifer had said quietly to me while the pages printed. "Almost generous. You could have destroyed them completely." "That's not what my grandmother would have wanted," I'd replied, watching my parents read through the contract with shaking hands. "She wanted people to learn, to grow, to become better. Destroying them wouldn't accomplish that." My father had signed first, his hand shaking so badly that his signature was barely legible. My mother had signed next, tears rolling down her face, leaving small wet spots on the paper. Melissa had signed last, taking the pen with trembling fingers and whispering, "Thank you," so quietly I'd almost not heard it. Harold had signed as a witness. Diane had signed as a witness. Helen had documented the entire signing with her tablet. Officer Winters had added her signature as well, giving the document an official weight that made it clear this wasn't just a family agreement, but something that law enforcement was aware of and would enforce if necessary. As my family had prepared to leave, gathering their belongings and moving toward their cars, with the defeated posture of people who'd just lost everything they'd taken for granted, Helen had turned to me. The feast was winding down, guests beginning to depart with full stomachs and happy faces, children running through the yard in the golden late afternoon light. "That was remarkable," Helen had said, her professional composure cracking slightly to show genuine emotion. "I've been covering family conflict stories for years, and I've never seen anything quite like what you just did. Most people, given that much power over the people who hurt them, would use it to hurt back. But you didn't. Why?" I'd looked across the yard to where Emma was helping clean up, carefully stacking plates and carrying them to the kitchen alongside Harold. She'd caught my eye and waved her face bright with pride at being helpful. "My grandmother taught me that the opposite of cruelty isn't more cruelty," I'd said. "It's dignity. Giving it even when it hasn't been earned, especially when it hasn't been earned, because that's how you break cycles instead of perpetuating them." Helen had smiled, making a note on her tablet. "The viewers will want to know, what did it feel like holding all the power over your family like that, having them completely at your mercy?" I'd thought about the question seriously, trying to articulate something I was only beginning to understand myself. I'd looked at my daughter again, at the community that had gathered to honor my grandmother at the house that would become Grace's table and feed people for years to come. "It felt like keeping a promise," I'd said finally, "the one I made to my daughter the day I adopted her, that no one would ever make her feel less than whole, and the one I made to my grandmother even though I didn't know I was making it at the time. To remember that no one eats last, not even the people who tried to make us last." 3 months had passed since that day in my grandmother's yard, 3 months of renovation and preparation and slow, painful transformation. The opening day of Grace's table had arrived on a crisp Saturday morning in late January, the kind of clear winter day where the air felt clean and full of possibility. I'd arrived early with Emma, both of us bundled in coats, our breath forming small clouds in the cold air as we'd stood looking at the house that had been completely transformed. The exterior had been repainted in warm cream and sage green colors my grandmother would have loved. The porch had been reinforced and widened to accommodate wheelchair access. but it was the sign above the door that had made my throat tighten with emotion. Hand-carved wood, elegant but not pretentious, reading, "Grace Chen's table, no one eats last." Below it, smaller letters added, "A community kitchen, everyone welcome." Inside, the transformation had been even more dramatic. The cramped kitchen had been expanded, walls knocked down and rebuilt to create a space that met commercial standards while still feeling like a home. Stainless steel appliances gleamed alongside my grandmother's old wooden countertops that we'd carefully preserved and refinished. Her cast iron pans hung in their same spots. Her wooden spoons stood in the ceramic crock. But now there was an industrial-size refrigerator, a 6-burner commercial range, and prep stations that could accommodate multiple cooks working simultaneously. The dining room had been expanded into what used to be a bedroom, creating space for 8 large tables that could seat 60 people comfortably. We'd hung my grandmother's photo prominently on the wall, a beautiful black-and-white portrait from her younger years, her eyes full of the fierce love and determination that had defined her life. Beneath it, a brass plaque read, "Grace Chen, 1931-2010. She taught us that feeding people is an act of love." Local news had arrived by 9 in the morning, a reporter and camera operator from the same station that aired Helen's show. They'd interviewed Daniel first, who'd been in the kitchen since dawn directing the preparation of my grandmother's recipes. Then they'd interviewed Harold and Diane, who'd talked about the dream that had brought them here 15 years ago. By the time they'd gotten to me, I'd been almost too emotional to speak coherently, but I'd managed to explain what we were trying to create, a place where dignity and nourishment came together, where everyone who walked through the door was treated as family. By 11, when we'd officially opened the doors, over 100 people had been waiting outside. Some were neighbors who remembered my grandmother carrying flowers and cards to honor her memory. Some were families from Harbor House, the children's home that had received the wedding donations here to support the woman who'd stood up for her daughter. Some were people who had seen Helen's documentary, which had aired 2 weeks earlier, to overwhelming response and wanted to be part of something they'd seen as both justice and grace in action. And then there was my family. My father had arrived wearing old jeans and a work shirt, his usual business casual wardrobe abandoned for clothes more suited to kitchen work. He'd headed straight for the dishwashing station without being told, rolling up his sleeves and positioning himself at the industrial sink like a soldier reporting for duty. His face had been set in grim determination, understanding that this was his penance, and accepting it without complaint. My mother had been assigned to the prep station, and I'd watched her stand shoulder to shoulder with a man named Robert, who'd been homeless until 6 months ago, and was now in transitional housing. She'd flinched initially when Daniel had made the assignments, her face showing that flash of superiority she'd always carried, but then something had shifted in her expression, and she'd picked up a knife and started chopping vegetables the way Robert had shown her. These were people she would have crossed the street to avoid a year ago. Now she worked beside them, learning from them, and I'd seen the beginning of something like humility in the careful way she'd listened to Robert's instructions about how to julienne carrots. Melissa had been the biggest surprise. At 5 months pregnant, she'd been visibly showing now her body transformed in ways that made her former vanity seem like a distant memory. She'd been taking orders at the front, greeting guests with a warmth that seemed genuine rather than performed. She'd smiled at an elderly woman who'd needed help reading the menu, had laughed with a group of teenagers from Emma's school, had crouched down to speak at eye level with a shy child who'd been overwhelmed by the crowd. When a well-dressed man had tried to tip her, pressing a $20 bill into her hand, she'd gently pushed it back with words I'd never thought I'd hear her say, "I'm volunteering. This is my penance. But thank you for the thought." Emma, who'd turned 9 just 2 weeks earlier, had appointed herself the official pie server. She'd spent the morning carefully cutting slices of the apple pie we'd made together the night before my grandmother's recipe, executed with the confidence of years of Sunday baking. She'd carried each plate with serious concentration, determined not to spill, beaming with pride every time someone complimented the pie. An elderly woman at table 4, someone I vaguely recognized from my grandmother's church, had stopped Emma as she'd delivered a slice. "This is delicious, honey. Did you help make it?" Emma had nodded enthusiastically. "It's my Nine Eyes recipe. My great-grandmother Grace Chen. Well, she's my great-grandmother in my heart. I'm adopted, but she's still my nai-nai." The woman's eyes had filled with tears. "You're Grace's great-granddaughter. Oh, sweetheart, she would be so proud of you, so very proud." She'd reached out and gently touched Emma's cheek. "Adoption doesn't make you less family. It makes you chosen family. That's even more special." Emma had practically glowed, running back to the kitchen to tell me what the woman had said. I'd hugged her tight, feeling my own tears threatening, and when I'd looked up, I'd seen Melissa standing in the doorway. She'd been watching the whole exchange, and her face had crumpled. She'd turned and walked quickly toward the back of the kitchen, and I'd followed her. I'd found her by the pantry, crying silently, her hands pressed against the wall as if she needed its support to stay upright. "She would have loved her," Melissa had whispered when she'd heard me approach. "Nai-Nai would have loved Emma so much. She would have taught her recipes and told her stories and made her feel like the most special person in the world." She'd turned to face me, her face wet with tears. "I'm sorry I never did. I'm sorry I was so cruel. I'm sorry I made her feel like she wasn't family when she's always been family. She's always been my niece. And I treated her like she was nothing." I hadn't known what to say. Part of me had wanted to accept the apology immediately, to fold my sister into a hug and tell her everything was forgiven. But the wounds were still fresh, the scars still forming, and I'd learned that premature forgiveness was often just another form of enabling. So I'd simply nodded and said, "I know you're sorry. Keep showing up. Keep doing the work. That's how you prove it." The day had continued in a blur of cooking and serving and cleaning and conversation. By the time we'd closed at 5, we'd fed over 200 people. Some had paid the suggested donation, some hadn't, and it hadn't mattered because that was never the point. The point was the full bellies, the warm smiles, the children who'd had seconds and thirds of dumplings, the veterans who'd sat together sharing stories, the young mother who'd cried with relief because she'd been able to feed her kids a real meal. As we'd cleaned up that night, all of us working together for the first time, as something that almost resembled a functional family, Emma had been sweeping the dining room floor with a broom almost as tall as she was. She'd stopped suddenly and looked at me with those serious, thoughtful eyes. "Mama, can Aunt Melissa and Grandma and Grandpa come to my birthday party next month? It's going to be at our apartment, and we're having pizza and cake, and I want them to come." The question had landed in the quiet room like a stone in still water. My mother, who'd been wiping down tables, had frozen mid-motion. She'd turned to look at me, and her face had been full of raw hope mixed with fear, the expression of someone who wanted something desperately, but had learned not to expect grace. My father had stopped loading the dishwasher. Melissa had come to stand in the doorway, one hand on her pregnant belly, waiting. I'd looked at my daughter, at her open, trusting face, at the girl who'd been hurt by these people, but who was willing to extend an invitation because she'd learned from my grandmother's example that everyone deserved a seat at the table. And I'd looked at my family, at the people who'd caused so much pain but who were slowly and imperfectly trying to become different. I'd hesitated, and in that hesitation, everyone had held their breath. Because some wounds don't heal in 3 months. I'd told Emma yes. Not immediately, not without the hesitation that my family had deserved, but eventually I'd said that Grandma, Grandpa, and Aunt Melissa could come to her birthday party. The look of pure joy on my daughter's face had made the decision feel right, even as part of me had remained wary, protective, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But the shoe I'd been expecting hadn't fallen. Instead, something else had happened that none of us had anticipated. Helen's documentary had aired on a Thursday evening in early February. Emma and I had watched it together on our couch, her tucked under my arm, both of us holding mugs of hot chocolate. Family Matters, No One Eats Last had been even more powerful than I'd expected. Helen had structured it chronologically, opening with context about family scapegoating and the particular vulnerability of adoptive families to this dynamic. Then had come the wedding footage, and even though I'd lived through it, watching it on screen had made me feel sick all over again. Melissa's smirk, the cruel words, the laughter that had rippled through the crowd, Emma's devastated face captured in brutal clarity. But Helen had balanced the cruelty with wisdom. She'd interwoven my grandmother's video will throughout the documentary, her voice providing moral commentary on what her family had become and what they could be. The segment showing the community feast had been beautiful, sun-drenched, and full of genuine joy. And the footage of Grace's table's opening day had captured something I hadn't fully appreciated while living through it, the visible transformation in my family as they'd worked, served, and slowly begun to understand what it meant to put others first. The documentary had included my parents' apology video, the one they'd filmed per our contract. They'd looked small and humbled on screen, my father's voice breaking as he'd said, "We were wrong. Adoption is love. This child is family. We are deeply sorry." My mother had cried through most of her portion, but her words had been clear. "Emma, you have always been our granddaughter. We failed to show you that. We failed your mother. We will spend the rest of our lives trying to be better." The final shot had been of Emma and me in my apartment kitchen baking apple pie together. Emma had been measuring flour, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration, and I'd been guiding her hands, both of us laughing when she'd gotten flour on her nose. Helen's voiceover had said, "Grace Chen believed no one should eat last." Her great-granddaughter Emma is learning that lesson not just from words, but from watching her mother choose grace over vengeance, boundaries over bitterness, and transformation over punishment. Perhaps that's the greatest inheritance of all. The response had been immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, clips from the documentary had been circulating on social media. By the next morning, it had gone regional, picked up by news outlets across the Pacific Northwest. By the weekend, it had gone national, with major media platforms sharing segments and think pieces being written about family dynamics, adoption, and restorative justice. My phone had been flooded with messages. My email inbox overwhelmed the Grace's Table website, crashing from traffic. The comments had been almost universally supportive. This is what boundaries look like. Adoption is love. Biological relation is just genetics. That grandmother saw the future and protected her great-granddaughter from beyond the grave. This woman is teaching her daughter that you can be both strong and kind. I'd received hundreds of direct messages from adopted children, some now adults, thanking me for standing up for Emma, for showing that adopted kids weren't less than, weren't obligated to accept cruelty just because it came from family. Adoptive parents had written to say they'd been struggling with similar dynamics, and the documentary had given them language and courage to set their own boundaries. Several women had shared their own stories of being family scapegoats, of watching siblings get preferential treatment, of absorbing years of emotional abuse while being told they were too sensitive or ungrateful. The common thread in all these messages had been a kind of vindication, a recognition that their experiences were real and valid, that they weren't crazy for feeling hurt by treatment that others dismissed as normal family teasing. Grace's Table had received donation offers from across the country. People had sent checks, had set up monthly contributions, had offered to sponsor meals or fund kitchen equipment. We'd received so much support that Daniel and I had been able to expand operations to 5 days a week instead of 3, had hired 2 part-time staff members to help coordinate volunteers, and had started a food bank program for families who needed groceries to take home. But the documentary had had consequences my family hadn't anticipated. My parents had started being recognized in public, and not in ways that made them comfortable. My mother had been at the grocery store when another shopper had approached her, recognizing her from the documentary. "You're that grandmother," the woman had said, her voice cold. "The one who laughed at that little girl. Shame on you." My mother had left her cart and walked out of the store without buying anything, had come home shaking and crying. Her book club had dropped her a polite but firm email explaining that several members felt uncomfortable continuing to socialize with her given what the documentary had revealed about her character. My father's golfing buddies had started making excuses about why they couldn't play their weekly game, gradually excluding him without anyone explicitly saying why. The country club, where they'd been members for 20 years, had not renewed their membership, citing budget restructuring, but the message had been clear. It had been humiliating for them, painful in ways I knew they'd never experienced before. For the first time in their lives, they'd faced social consequences, for their actions had felt what it was like to be judged and found wanting by their community. Part of me had felt a grim satisfaction watching them squirm. But another part, the part that my grandmother had nurtured, had felt an unexpected sympathy for how lost they'd looked as their social world had contracted. The shift had started happening during their volunteer hours at Grace's table. A middle-aged man had approached my father while he'd been washing dishes, had introduced himself as someone who'd watched the documentary. My father had tensed, waiting for another accusation, another dose of public shame. But the man had said, "I was a lot like you. Treated my daughter terribly favored. My son didn't realize what I was doing until she cut me off completely. That was 5 years ago. I haven't spoken to her since." He'd paused, watching my father's hands still in the soapy water. "It takes courage to admit you were wrong and to do something about it. Keep going. Maybe it's not too late for you." My mother had had a similar encounter, a woman who'd recognized her and had shared her own story of being the scapegoat daughter who'd eventually walked away from her family entirely. "What you're doing here," the woman had said, gesturing around Grace's table. "It matters. It won't erase what you did, but it's something. It's more than most people do." These small moments of grace from strangers had seemed to crack something open in my parents. They'd started arriving at Grace's table early, staying late, asking Daniel for extra tasks, working with a kind of desperate diligence that suggested they were beginning to understand that redemption wasn't something that would be granted to them, but something they'd have to earn, minute by minute, choice by choice, day by day. Melissa had been recognized too, but her experience had been different. Several young women had approached her to share their own stories of being used by men, of believing promises that turned out to be lies, of having to rebuild their lives from scratch. One woman had been 7 months pregnant when her partner had abandoned her, and she'd held Melissa's hand and said, "You're going to be okay. The baby doesn't need a father who was a con artist. The baby just needs you, and you're learning how to be better. That's enough." 2 weeks after the documentary had aired, I'd been at work when my assistant had brought me a large envelope that had arrived in the mail. The return address had been the adoption agency I'd worked with 8 years ago, the place where my journey with Emma had officially begun. Inside had been a handwritten note on professional letterhead and a photograph slightly faded showing a very young woman holding a newborn baby, both of them in a hospital room. The note had been written in careful, neat handwriting. "Dear Ms. Here, Chen, you don't know me, but I know your daughter. My name is Patricia Wong, and I'm the labor and delivery nurse who was present the day Emma was born. I've been following your story through the news coverage and the documentary, and I felt compelled to reach out. There's something about Emma's story you need to know, something that was in her file, but that the agency may not have shared with you because it wasn't deemed relevant at the time. But watching what you've built, seeing how you've honored your grandmother's legacy, I believe you deserve to know the whole truth about the day your daughter came into this world." My hands had started shaking as I'd read those words, and I'd had to sit down at my desk staring at the photograph of the young woman and the baby who would become mine. "There's something about her story you need to know." I'd read the rest of the letter with trembling hands. My office door closed, tears streaming down my face as Nurse Patricia Wong's careful handwriting revealed a story I'd never known. Emma's birth mother had been just 16 years old, a high school junior from a troubled home situation. She'd hidden her pregnancy for 5 months, terrified of her parents' reaction, terrified of what it would mean for her future. When she'd finally told a school counselor, the wheels had been set in motion for adoption. She'd been adamant about one thing: she wanted her baby to have everything she couldn't provide. A stable home. A parent who'd chosen to be a parent. A chance at a life without the chaos and instability that had defined her own childhood. She held Emma for 2 hours after the birth, Nurse Wong had written. She cried the entire time, but she never wavered in her decision. She said, "I love you enough to give you to someone who can love you better." Those were her exact words. She requested a closed adoption because she said seeing updates would break her heart, but she left a letter to be given to Emma when she turned 18. She wanted Emma to know she was loved, that the adoption was a gift, not an abandonment. The nurse had included her contact information and an offer to facilitate communication with the adoption agency if I wanted to ensure the letter would be preserved and delivered when the time came. "Your daughter looks happy in the documentary," she'd written at the end. "She looks loved and confident and strong. Her birth mother would be so glad. I thought you should know that her story began with love, even though it began with goodbye." I'd gone home early that day, unable to focus on spreadsheets and quarterly reports when my mind was full of a teenage girl I'd never met, who'd made the hardest decision of her life so that Emma could have mine. That evening after dinner, I'd sat with Emma on her bed and shared what the nurse had told me. I'd been careful with my words, watching her face for signs of distress or confusion, ready to stop if it became too much. Emma had listened quietly, her stuffed rabbit clutched in her lap, her expression thoughtful in that way she had of processing big emotions internally before expressing them. When I'd finished, she'd been silent for a long moment, and I'd waited, giving her space to feel whatever she needed to feel. "So my birth mom was really young," she'd said finally. "Like only a little older than some of the high school volunteers at Grace's table." "Yes, sweetheart, she was very young. Too young to be a parent, she felt. But old enough to know she loved you and wanted you to have a good life." Emma had nodded slowly, her fingers tracing patterns on her rabbit's worn fur. "I have a birth mother who loved me enough to choose someone better," she'd said, and the maturity in her voice had been heartbreaking. "And I have you who loved me enough to fight for me when people were mean. And I have a Nai who loved all of us, even after she was gone, who made sure I'd be taken care of." She'd looked up at me, then her eyes clear and bright. "I'm really lucky, Mama. I have 3 moms." The simplicity and wisdom of her words had undone me completely. I'd pulled her into my arms and cried into her hair, and she'd patted my back the way I usually patted hers when she was upset, my daughter comforting me through her own revelation. "It's okay, Mama," she'd whispered. "I'm not sad. I'm just thinking about how much love that is. That's a lot of people loving me." 1 year after the canceled wedding, Emma's 10th birthday had arrived on a warm October Saturday. We'd decided to hold the party at Grace's table rather than our apartment, and Emma had been thrilled with the idea of celebrating in her Nai's house surrounded by the community we'd built together. We'd invited her school friends' children from Harbor House volunteers from Grace's table, and yes, my family. The house had been decorated simply colorful streamers and balloons that Emma had helped hang the night before. We'd pushed several tables together to create one long birthday table, and chairs had been arranged in a way that ensured everyone could sit together, that no one would be relegated to a separate space or made to feel less important. Harold had made his famous dumplings, Diane had prepared spring rolls, and Daniel had coordinated a feast that rivaled anything we served on our regular community days. My parents had arrived early, both of them immediately rolling up their sleeves and heading to the kitchen to help with preparations. They'd worked quietly and efficiently, my father peeling vegetables while my mother arranged platters, both of them moving with the practiced ease of people who'd spent the last year learning how to serve. They'd greeted Emma with warm hugs and birthday wishes, and I'd watched carefully for any sign of condescension or performative affection, but what I'd seen had seemed genuine. My mother's eyes had been bright with tears when Emma had shown her the new dress she'd picked out for the party, and my father had listened with apparent real interest as Emma had told him about her science project on photosynthesis. Melissa had arrived with baby Grace, and the sight of my sister carrying a 3-month-old infant had been surreal. She'd named the baby after our grandmother, a gesture that had surprised me but that felt right somehow. Little Grace had her mother's blonde hair, but a temperament that seemed much calmer than Melissa's had ever been. Melissa herself had been transformed by motherhood in ways I was still trying to understand. The sharp edges had softened the entitled attitude, replaced by something that looked like humility earned through hardship. Emma had been immediately fascinated by the baby, had asked to hold her under Melissa's careful supervision, and had cooed at her tiny cousin with such tenderness that several guests had taken photos. "She's so small," Emma had whispered, cradling Grace's head carefully. "Was I this small when you adopted me, Mama?" "Even smaller," I'd said. "You were just 3 months old, about Grace's age." And you wanted me anyway. Emma had said not a question but a statement of fact, something she'd internalized so deeply that it had become part of her identity. I wanted you more than anything in the world, I'd replied, and Melissa had looked away quickly, wiping at her eyes. When the time had come to bring out the birthday cake, a beautiful 2-layer chocolate cake that Emma had helped decorate with rainbow sprinkles and 10 candles, everyone had gathered around the long table. We'd sung happy birthday while Emma had glowed in the attention, her face lit by candlelight and pure joy. She'd closed her eyes, made a wish, and blown out all 10 candles in one breath to enthusiastic applause. I'd handed her the cake knife, ready to help her cut the first slice as was tradition, but Emma had taken it confidently and made a careful cut. Then she'd lifted the slice onto a small plate and walked around the table to where Melissa sat, holding baby Grace. This piece is for Grace, Emma had said, handing the plate to her aunt. She's the youngest, 9 eyes rule, no one eats last. The room had gone completely quiet, and then Melissa had started crying, silent tears rolling down her face as she'd accepted the plate with shaking hands. Thank you, Emma, she'd managed to say. That's very kind. It's not kind. Emma had corrected her gently with the matter-of-fact wisdom of a child who'd learned her lessons well. It's just what we do. Everyone gets fed. Everyone gets a seat. No one eats last. As the party had continued and Emma had cut slices for everyone else, making sure each person got an equal piece, chatting happily with her guests, and making sure no one was sitting alone or feeling left out, I'd watched her with an overwhelming sense of gratitude and wonder. She'd taken the pain of rejection and the gift of my grandmother's wisdom and had transformed them into something beautiful, a way of moving through the world that centered generosity and inclusion, that refused to replicate the harm that had been done to her. My grandmother's photo had looked down on the scene from its place on the wall, and I'd felt her presence so strongly it had been almost physical, as if she'd been standing right beside me, her wooden spoon in hand, satisfied that her lessons had taken root not just in me, but in her great-granddaughter, who'd never met her, but who carried her legacy forward with every kind gesture, every inclusive act, every moment of making sure no one ate last. I'd looked around this table at this imperfect family that had been broken and was slowly being repaired, at the community that had gathered to celebrate a child who'd been told she was leftovers and who'd proven she was a feast. My parents were laughing with Emma's teacher. Melissa was showing baby Grace to Harold and Diane. Daniel was telling a story that had a group of kids in stitches. Emma was at the center of it all, radiant and confident and loved. And for the first time in my 43 years, I'd understood what my grandmother had been teaching me all along. Justice without mercy was just revenge cold and ultimately empty. Mercy without justice was allowing harm to continue unchecked. But mercy plus justice, boundaries enforced with compassion, consequences balanced with the possibility of redemption, that was grace. And grace, I'd learned, could feed more souls than any amount of cake ever could. Thank you for listening to Sarah and Emma's story. If this tale of standing up for what's right touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. What would you have done in Sarah's position? Would you have canceled the wedding or found another way? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories matter, and I read every single one. Until next time, remember, no one eats last.